A very good afternoon to you. It's 3 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show here on GB News. We're broadcasting for you live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK. On today's show, of course, we'll bring you all of the very latest on the dramatic court case going on as we speak. Of course, the triple child killer, Axel Rudakabana, facing the sentencing today. Presiding is KC Deanna here. We're expecting the ruling to come down, perhaps from the next hour onwards, perhaps as late as 5 o'clock. The proceedings have been delayed twice already by Rudakabana having outbursts, shouting outbursts, proclaiming he needed a paramedic, proclaiming he had chest pains. This is despite the fact he was deemed fit to stand, both this morning and after the afternoon recess. Seems to be physically nothing wrong with him whatsoever. Of course, we're looking in there over the evidence are family members of those who lost their lives and also survivors, wanting their moment in court, wanting their moment of justice. And so far, Rudakabana has made an absolute farce of that. He's behaved with the most contemptible selfishness. He's made it all about him. He's been hugely distressing to anybody in the court. Those poor family members have just got to the stage of proceedings, always one of the most heartfelt and delicate, where they read out their human impact statements of what this has done to them. Throughout the course of the day, some graphic detail, simply too horrendous to talk about on national television, has come out. My colleague Mark White and my colleague Sophie Reba, who's inside the court there, Liverpool Crown Courts, have been fiercely reporting on this throughout the day. At times, very, very harrowing, very, very moving, very, very heartfelt evidence. And we are following this through now all the way until justice is served and Rudakabana is sent down. For that is sure to happen this afternoon. On that note now, let's bring in GB News' home and security editor, Mark White, who's been valiantly outside Liverpool Crown Court all day. Mark, can I just say, by astonishing reporting, you've been unflinching, you've been telling it as it is, you've been rolling on air for hours, mate. I know that's difficult, and I know you would not like me to say that this is about you. You're doing your job, but you've been brilliant. Sophie Reaper inside, I've been messaging her because it's who knows how harrowing it is to hear what's going on in that court. Mark White, we saw some of the videos, some of the pictures very early on. They were leaking out. That's being shown in court today. Heaven knows what those inside are being subjected to. Mark White, for those who are just joining us at 3 o'clock today, can you bring us fully up to speed?
Yes, indeed. Well, Axel Rudakabana was brought to court today, just about 10:30 this morning. He didn't attend the court initially. There was a delay. Proceedings were expected to get underway at 11 a.m, but he was, it seems, refusing to go up into the dock, as you said in your summary so well there, Martin, claiming that he was ill, protesting that he needed medical attention. But he was eventually persuaded to go up to the dock. He wasn't in there seconds, and he was mumbling at first that he was unwell, and then as the prosecutor started to set out the case against him, and especially the fact that he was heard in the custody suite, caught on an audio device recording within that custody suite, muttering to himself how glad he was that these children had died, that effectively he'd achieved what he wanted to do, that he had no feelings on it, that he was neutral to what had happened. When that evidence was being read out by the prosecutor at that point, Axel Rudakabana much more vocal in saying that he needed medical attention, shouting, screaming at the judge that he needed to see a doctor, claiming that he had chest pains. His defence lawyer then spoke, said that he hadn't eaten for several days, that he wasn't drinking. he continued to scream. At that point, clearly, there was no point in continuing with him in the dock. The judge decided that he should be sent back down to the cells and ordered that a doctor, that a medic, assess him to determine whether he was fit to continue. And of course the evidence continued without him, and then we got to the point after lunch, Martin, where the assessment had been made. The doctor had said that he was fine, that he was fit enough to come back into the dock, and the defence team said he will come up, he will behave himself this time. But he wasn't back in the dock more than a few minutes before he started screaming and shouting again about how ill he was and the need to see a medic. At that point, the judge decided to remove him from the dock. The first time, of course, that he was removed from the dock, we saw the frustration of the parents who've had to contend with so much as a result of the actions of this individual on the 29th of July last year. Sergio da Silva Aguila, who is the father of Alice da Silva Aguila, just 9 years old when her life was ended by Axel Rudacabana, shouted after him, "Coward," as he left the court and headed back down to the cells. And we've been hearing just in the last few minutes impact statements, Martin, absolutely heartbreaking victim impact statements being read out in court. And among those are victim impact statements from the family of Alice da Silva Aguila. And I'll try and get through this for you. As you say, it's difficult, but we've got to remain professional. It might be difficult for us. It's absolutely unbearable for the family. So we've got to just get through this and impart as best we can the thoughts and the feelings of those family members. So Alice's parents said in a statement that they were going to surprise her with a trip to Disneyland that summer of last year, the summer she died. Alice fought for 14 hours to survive the attack, but once her life was lost, we lost our lives too, they said in the statement. We used to cook for 3 and now we only cook for 2, was the statement from the parents of this young girl. And as I say, we're just continuing to hear impact statement after impact statement that is truly heartbreaking, and one in particular that really just stopped me in my tracks when I heard it before was from Leanne Lucas, one of the adults so badly injured that day, stabbed as she tried her very best to save the young girls who were being stabbed to death and injured by Axel Rudacabana. And Leanne Lucas said, "How can I live knowing I survived when children died?" It goes really, I think, to show just how traumatized the people are, not just, of course, those 3 girls who died, and how completely and utterly tragic and pointless those deaths were, but those who were injured and survived, those who were not injured and survived, just the trauma that they will have to live with for the rest of their lives. Children, we know, are resilient, and many of those children, some will perhaps respond better than others, but they'll get it, they'll try to get on with their lives and live their lives. But for the adults, you can understand in hearing from Leanne Lucas how terrible she feels that she was not able to do more. But she shouldn't feel terrible, because everyone that knows anything about what happened there knows just how hard she tried and John Hayes tried to save these girls.
Mark White, in any case like this, I remember the Valdo Calacane case, the triple killing in my home city of Nottingham, the murder of Brianna Jai. The victim impact statements are so raw. I mean, those vignettes that everybody can relate to. We used to cook for 3 and now we cook for 2. I mean, these are the things where life is forever changed. by this psychopath, this utter psychopath who clearly premeditated this. This was clearly a plan. There's clearly no sense of regret. To actually say, I'm glad these children are dead. Mark White, you've been covering many, many cases through your illustrious and long career. Do you recall coming face to face with such unimaginable evil as Axel Rudakabana?
I've seen lots of evil people that are put before the courts, and you know, he's right up there, I have to say. An absolutely twisted, violent young man who, for whatever twisted logic was in his head, decided he wanted to cause as much carnage as possible, and he did that. But of course, as you said, you know, I've seen many of these people, and of course a lot of them are so cowardly that, you know, they kill themselves and martyr themselves. They never have to face justice at the end of the day, so you don't get to look evil in the eye. But I've been at all of the court cases that Axel Rudakabana was present at in the lead up to the trial, because in the legal process, once he's charged, he initially appears at a magistrate's court, then it's referred up to a Crown Court, then there are various other sort of what they call sort of plea and directions hearings as the case continues towards its eventual trial. And you say, you know, looking evil in the eye. Well, this is a young man, you didn't want to look anyone really in the eye. This was a young man that hid his face mostly, either by wearing a surgical mask or pulling a jumper up over his face to hide from the view of those in court as he sat there in the dock, completely unwilling to engage in any way, shape or form with the legal process, showing absolute and utter contempt for that process, refusing even to give or confirm his name, his age, his address, the kind of things that don't require long and lengthy interaction with the legal team in court, just an acknowledgement. He wouldn't do that. That's why it was such a surprise, Martin, when he pleaded guilty to the 16 counts against him on Monday. And we heard from him, we've heard an awful lot of him today as he's been bleating away in the dock, but we heard for the first time really from him on Monday when he muttered his guilty pleas to the 16 counts against him. And enough about him for a second, because I just want to take you back to the victim impact statements and bring you one written and read out on behalf of one of the young girls that he stabbed. Now, these girls are not being named because of an anonymity order to protect their identities. They've got to go on with their lives and try to live their lives as best they can after these events. So they're not being named, but this one little girl says this in her statement. I want you to know, this is directly to Axel Rudakabana, that you changed mine and my sister's lives forever. But whilst you live behind bars alone, I will make sure that my sisters and I and our family will do our best to move forward with our lives. Defiance and a direct response to Axel Rudakabana himself. Is not even in dock, is not listening to it and will not care anyway. But one young girl determined to go on to live her life, to make as best a life as possible, despite his attempts to end it.
Mark White, you know, such bravery from that child surpasses anything that this maggot has ever achieved with his life. The bravery of that girl to say, to know that life goes on. And, you know, Axel Rudakabana's life will go on. He'll go to jail later on today. Can I, before I get into some of the graphic details of the injuries, can I talk about something which so many people are discussing, and that is how wrong-footed people were by this guilty verdict. Because, Mark, you and I and everybody in the journalistic trade fully expected him to plead not guilty, for this to go to a full trial. In fact, the family themselves, all of the families, Mark White, were so wrong-footed by this, they didn't even turn up for that trial because they were so convinced this would be a not guilty. He's gone to a guilty verdict. First of all, I'd like to ask you why you think that is. And secondly, there was no mental health card played. Everybody at the start said, there we go, he's going to plead that it was mental, some kind of insanity, diminished responsibility. Mark, that hasn't happened. He's being tried in a regular court. There's been no mental health overlay. What does that tell us about what has been an astonishing state of affairs, which in many ways wrong-footed all of the journalists and indeed the family and the defence?
Yeah, I mean, it took everybody by surprise. Of course it did, because, as I said, he has just not been willing to engage with the legal process at all. And what the legal process requires, if someone doesn't even speak to the point of confirming any details about themselves or enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, then the state and the criminal justice system will enter a not guilty plea on behalf of that individual to take it forward, to try to ensure that they are given a fair trial. As, you know, absolutely gut-wrenchingly, you know, anger-making as that might be to so many people out there, to hear that he should be, you know, afforded the luxury of the criminal justice system doing its level best to give him the fairest trial possible, given what he did that day on the 29th of July. That's the way the criminal justice system works. And because he'd not engaged in any way, shape or form with the legal process, nobody expected it, as you say, Martin, and everybody was wrong-footed by that. We don't know, though, what it was that changed his mind. It is true that if you plead guilty before a trial gets underway, and in fact, the earliest opportunity to plead guilty, of course, is your first court appearance. If you plead guilty at the very earliest opportunity, there is credit given to you in terms of a reduction in your sentence. And the later you leave it, the less credit you get. But even still, pleading guilty and allowing the families not to have to go through the ordeal of sitting through 8 weeks of often very harrowing evidence that we're only hearing in summary form today, the credit will mean that there should be a reduction in the sentence he gets. However, given the so many aggravating factors in this case, it's likely to make very little difference to the sentence that this man will receive anyway, because there were so many aggravating factors: the violent past, the very determined nature of a targeted attack, not just a random attack, not someone caught up in an incident where they took a life as part of, you know, some other motive that was not pre-planned. This was pre-planned, targeted, the most vulnerable in society targeted by this individual. So many aggravating factors that the fact he's pleaded is likely to matter very little in the sense of what time behind bars he will be facing. However, there is one aspect of the sentencing that, again, will anger many, and that is the option of handing a whole life tariff down to him is not available to the judge, because this teenager, still 18 of course, was 17 at the time that he committed those murders and stabbed the other girls and the 2 adults. So the whole life tariff is not available to be handed down to someone who is considered still to be a child under the age of 18. Now, that doesn't mean that there will not be a very significant sentence that's handed down to the judge. And it will be, of course, the desired wish of the families and the wider community that as much as humanly possible, this man should never taste freedom again, and that he should be a very, very old man indeed before he's ever even considered for release.
Mark White, before we get into some of the details of that day which have emerged from the court today, would you simply take your breath away? Can I just get an idea from you about the time frame of proceedings now? When do we think we can expect there to be a ruling? When do we think, is there any idea of a timeline of when Ruda might finally be sent down to jail?
Well, what the point we're at the moment, Martin, is still the victim impact statements that are coming out from court itself. So once we've got through them, and there could be quite a few because there are a lot of victims here. It's not just those who were directly affected in terms of the bereaved families and the injured, but as I say, there were 25 children who attended that dance class, and all of those are people who are victims of this individual in carrying out this crime. So there could be quite a few victim impact statements. Once we get the impact statements concluded, it's possible we may then break before the judge comes back to begin his sentencing. And in the sentencing, normally, and we hope that this will be the case, that will be on camera, and at least part, if not all, of the judge's sentencing remarks will be available to us and on a delay. Now, the judge said, very interestingly, despite the outbursts from Ruda, that he was determined that this man should still be in the dock for the sentence handed down. So not necessarily the entirety of the judge's remarks, but when he gets to the point of jailing him and handing down that jail term, that he should be in the dock. It could be a messy affair, though, as I say. He's not been compliant. He's been determined to be as disruptive as possible. So let's just see if that is possible. And if it does happen, the way in which the system in court operates is that it's on a delay, because those within the criminal justice system don't want defendants, convicted criminals, showboating and getting whatever particular message they want across at that point. So if he does start screaming again when the judge is handing down the sentence, we might just suddenly see it go to black even before we get to that point. So we should be prepared for that. But we will get, as I say, the sentencing and at least some, hopefully, all of that sentencing remark from the judge on camera when he gets to that point, when he does that, Martin. But for the moment, at least we're still in the victim impact statements and hearing, just how the terrible actions of this individual, the murderous intent of this teenager, really just destroyed the lives of so many people that day in this Merseyside town.
And Mark Wyatt, there's just some more information emerging now from those victim statements. I'd like to just read one of those out just to give you a bit of a breather, and your excellent work there. I know you've been going for hours and hours. This has just come out of court from inside. And a 14-year-old girl who survived the Southport stabbings has addressed her attacker and demanded, "Give me a reason for what you did." Reading her statement via a video link, the girl, who cannot be named for legal reasons, told Liverpool Crown Court the day of the attack turned into a living nightmare. She continued, "I thought you were playing a joke. I saw you in your green hoodie and your face mask. The thing I remember most about you is your eyes. You didn't look human. You looked possessed. I watched you stab someone and then I saw you coming for me. It was like slow motion. You stabbed me in the arm and instinctively I turned, and that's when you continued to stab me in the back although I didn't feel it at the time. All I could hear was the screams. I was so scared of what you were doing, and I was in a blind panic. I ran out onto the landing, and there was a group of girls huddled, and I began just screaming for the girls to get down the stairs. I remember I was physically pushing them down the stairs to get them out of the building and to get them away from you. I knew I was running for my life. I needed to try to get everyone out and to safety. That was my first thought. Describing the aftermath of the attack, the 14-year-old victim, by the way, what an astonishing human being. What an astonishing human being to have the guts to do this and to make him hear this. He should have been there to listen to this. He didn't even have the guts for that, but she had the guts to read this out, and she said this. She said, physically I've healed, but my scars remain a reminder of what you did to me and to us all. No sane person could do that. It's sickening what you did, going in there knowing you're going into a room full of defenseless children. Give me a reason for what you did. Arming yourself with a weapon and stabbing children. I hope you spend the rest of your life knowing that we think you are a coward. What an astonishing thing to say. And that is what these court appearances are about. They're not just about resolution and about justice, although by God, of course, that's vitally important. It's about giving families an opportunity to be heard and to make sure that he hears. And he didn't even have the guts to face these people who are more human than he will ever be in his sorry little life. Let's go back to Mark White now, outside the court. Mark, these are the details that simply blow you away. The power to survive, the power to live on, the power to be heard, the courage to say this, puts the survivors in a stratosphere of humanity that Rada Cabana can only ever dream of.
Yeah, and actually it's really positive to hear you read out statements like that, and I read out something very similar just a few minutes earlier about young lives, resilient, hopefully, young girls who are going to go on and make something of their lives despite the absolute horror and violence that this man had in store for them. Of course, they're absolutely traumatized, but because they're young, because they're children, the hope is that they will be able to get on, put that behind them at some point. Of course, they're going to live with it to some extent for the rest of their lives, but the determination to be as positive as they can be, to live their lives to the very fullest, is very, very heartwarming to hear, but mixed in with the melancholy nature of what we're hearing from the families about how they have been absolutely torn apart by the loss of loved ones, by the impact it's had on loved ones as well. And as you say, he doesn't even want to sit in the dock and listen to this. And, part of me is glad that he's not in there, because the last thing we want is him screaming and belly aching when we are hearing very impactful statements from those affected by his murderous intent.
And, it's so important to find any form of resolution, to be able to move on for the families, not only of those reading those statements out, but for their loved ones, for their entire communities, for their schools, for their friendship circles, for the town, for the country. Mark White, for humanity, to be able to rise like this and just be so incredible in the face of such a subhuman individual as Axel Cabana. And more of these statements will be read out in time, and we will make it our duty to bring them to you, the viewers and listeners, as we get them. Mark, there was also some incredibly distressing information coming out today. a great body of which is simply too distressing for us even to repeat. The video evidence, Mark, I know that you've seen some of it. I have too. I don't know how much of that would have been shown in court today. It's beyond human comprehension, and I wouldn't wish it upon anybody to even see, let alone for that to be a part in any capacity of your life, of your community's life. But the nature of the killings, Mark, and again, just to warn you, there are some distressing details. I won't be too graphic here, but it was a frenzied attack, Mark White. These killings were absolutely frenzied. B.B. King, age 6, a piece of information came out, was stabbed at least 122 times, Mark. 122 times. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Elsie Dot Stankham, who was just 7, the post-mortem suggested she'd been stabbed at least 85 sharp force injuries. Mark White, when you hear that level of detail, that level of the frenzy in the attack, as difficult as it is to talk about, does it not tell us, though, the state of mind, the total lack of empathy, of humanity, of anything from this individual? Those are the kind of things that will give resolve and steel to the KC to make sure today that justice is absolutely and fully served onto Axel Rudakabana.
Yes, I mean, and I should say with regard, Martin, to the very graphic detail with regard to the injuries that the little girls suffered, we were asked by the families, very understandably, the other members of the media as well, just to be careful in the kind of detail that we put out there and the very graphic nature of some of the evidence that we heard in court. But you're right, the number of times that these children were stabbed is absolutely and utterly horrific. It is one of the greatest aggravating factors that the judge will take into consideration when he is passing the sentence here. And as I said, it will anger so many people, the knowledge that because this man was 17 when he carried out that attack last July, he escapes the possibility of being jailed for the rest of his life, given what they call a whole life sentence. You have to be over 18 now to qualify for that. These are not given out on a regular basis. They are rare decisions by a judge to hand down a whole life sentence. They are done in the most extreme cases. If this man had been over 18, I think it is an absolute given that he would be receiving a whole life sentence. It may be, and I'm, to some extent speculating, but I would not be surprised in the aftermath of the sentence, depending what it is, maybe the judge can come up with a sentence that satisfies people, but it may be, given that this man was just 10 days from his 18th birthday when he carried out that attack, that perhaps there is either a change to the law or some kind of appeal or disposition that is given that can allow the judge to pass a whole life tariff. Because I think anything other than the knowledge that this man will never exit prison again will not be enough for many, many people. And you can understand it would not be enough for the families as well, who would never want to see this person see daylight again. So I guess that's up to the Attorney General, the government perhaps, to look at that. It depends what the families say. It depends what the judge says today and what that totality of that sentence that's handed down is, because it's difficult to react to a sentence until it's actually passed, because we don't know the factors that he has to take into consideration and the factors that he maybe has that allow him to apply even more in the way of a tougher sentence. So we'll know that within the next hour or two, I'm sure, once that sentencing from the judge is complete, Martin.
Thank you very much, Mark White. We're going to give you a break now. You've been talking for a great deal of time. We'll come back to you in a short while. But now I'm joined by the barrister, Stephen Barrett. Stephen, welcome to the show. You've been listening into all of this all day. I know you have, and I know, as I am, you've been greatly moved by a lot of this evidence, particularly the victim statements, the impact statements, which I just find astonishing. They're the one gleaming beam of comfort in all of this, aren't they? Because this is the chance for people to have their say, to let them know how they're feeling. Could I ask you, though, on a legal point, something which a lot of people have been talking about, and that is having the power to compel people like Radicabana to get in that dock and face the music. And Stephen Barrett, you will well remember, because you and I talked about this at the time, after the trial of Lucy Letby. We're going to change the law, they said, because she also refused to go in the dock. We're not tough enough on these people, they said. Absolutely nothing's changed. And here we are again, this monster, this imbecile, is able to dictate what goes on in that court. And Stephen Barrett, many people are starting to say, once again, as they did in October 2023 with Lucy Letby, it feels like the system bows down to the needs of killers rather than those who've been impacted.
I can understand how people feel that. I have to say today, I have been much more impressed with how the court has behaved. I have become a great fan of Mr. Justice Goose, who previously I'd never heard of, but who dealt with this in a very muscular way. That's why he's been in the dock a couple of times. There is then the practical problem that he's just been mouthing off. And so the judge has shouted at him and tried to shut him up. I think that we should go further. I doubt the judge has capacity today to do something like put him in a straitjacket or even, have action should be taken. Justice should be muscular. Defendants must face the music. And when we moved away with that with Lucy Letby, when there were a number of legal experts who would go out in the press and say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, the judge just doesn't have the power. Firstly, they were wrong, Martin. The judge definitely does have the power. The more important question is, what is our political appetite for it? And having seen these scenes today, I'm telling you, I have an awful lot more political appetite for the judge using maximum, force to get people into the dock and to shut them up. I have seen people try and argue with judges. People have said that when they go to court, it's sort of like a remarkable world, because so much of the outside world is a compromise, where actually, if you kick off, if you go down Testo and you just start screaming, you'll probably get your own way. And these people, they learn that if you just kick off, you probably get your own way, because we've become quite a weak and compromised society. Well, that simply cannot be the truth of justice. Justice is not negotiable. Justice is not a competition of strength. Justice is not how loud you scream or how much you kick off. Justice is the thing that's in charge of you. Justice is the rule of law that binds us all. We are all bound by it. Mr. Rabikana is bound by it too. And that's the point the judge was making to him. I'm in charge of this courtroom, not you. And I was very impressed with this judge. So if people are at home being very disappointed on this point, I'd say I think today is a remarkable step forward. I didn't like where we were with Lucy Letby, with the court being performatively weak. It's absolutely pathetic. We're only going to fix our society if we stand up, man up, and admit that we can actually do things and don't sort of hide under the bed and pretend that we can't do anything. It's nonsense. Good. So I think that people should be pleased with this judge.
Well, that's great to hear. And if they have your recommendation, then that's good for me. Can I ask you about something else? I know you and I have talked about a lot, and that is the seeming nonsense, and again, causing a huge amount of public discord today about the fact Radicabana can't get a whole life tariff, a whole life term, because he's 9 days short of his 18th birthday. So in the eyes of the law, he's being treated as a minor. Is this another example of a law that's out of date? How can we say that 17-year-olds with the physical size, with the physical stress, with the mental situation, whatever it is, of Rudy Cabana doesn't know what he's doing? It's clearly premeditated. Everyone legally involved thus far has admitted. Premeditated, planned, richly researched, embedded in psychopathy. Now, this individual didn't just decide to do this on a whim. It was planned. And with that level of planning, with that level of mental investment in the grotesque acts he did, why can we not treat him as an adult? Is it not time to overhaul that and say, look, these people are growing up fast these days, let's change the law? Why not go back to 16, for example? I mean, the Labour Party want to give votes to 16-year-olds. Why not treat them as criminals when they're 16?
Well, exactly. He stabbed a little girl, 122 times. I mean, that's just inconceivable. This is just inconceivable evil. It's unbelievable what he has done. And I think Keir Starmer has missed a trick here, because he would have known that this would apply almost instantaneously. He's an experienced criminal KC. He would know the state of the sentencing law, and he should have used his majority, in my view, to change the rules in order to capture Axel. Now, lawyers who are more prone to hysteria than me will tell you that they can't possibly do that. We can't possibly have a retrospective punishment, which is simply not true. We use them all the time in tax law. So don't believe a lawyer who suddenly wets themselves at the idea of a unique punishment. Keir Starmer has an Act of Parliament for his own pension. That's pretty unique. It's literally the Keir Starmer Act of Parliament. So we could have done, and we could legislate still to punish this man in a unique and special way. It is clearly a unique event. His own MP is calling for that, and he's a Labour MP, so he's not exactly praising his boss. But there we are. This takes more precedence. This is an unbelievable circumstance, and if we want to fix our punishment rules in order to make sure that we get to a situation that is just, then I think we should. I have to say, with this judge and him shouting so much in the dock, I think he's added years to his sentence. Because I'm surely, it's not just that he shows no remorse, he's trying to make their day worse. And I don't want him to get credit for a guilty plea either, because I think he waited till the absolute last minute to plead guilty, just to cause them as much pain and suffering as possible. I mean, those victims went to sleep Sunday night thinking there's going to be a trial. That's, or whatever night it was, I forget the days of the week, but, that is traumatic. That has been very damaging. And I think if we want to take robust action, we should remind ourselves that we should man up as a country and deal with this. I think we need to heal about this as well. I mean, that's the other one. I mean, whether you like him or loathe him, Boris Johnson would not have dealt with this event the way that the Prime Minister has dealt with it at all. Boris would have been out there in the crowd. I don't believe there'd be a riot. He wouldn't have spent 19 seconds laying down a plastic wreath and then running back to London. He would have spent time with them. He would have talked to them. He wouldn't have been heckled. And the whole nation would have not known details that prejudice the trial. Nobody wants to prejudice the trial. But you can tell details. Starmer's own position that you can't say that that this was terrorism is obviously wrong. And if he could say that it was terrorism in October, he could say it was terrorism in August. There's no, and they knew about the ricin. That's a pretty big flag that it's terrorism. This is nonsense. And I just simply feel the entire thing has been absolutely mishandled. So I've talked to people in Southport, as I know you have, and victims. I mean, one of them simply said, "How dare he call us far right? We all vote Labour." That was his result, and he knew all of this, because we've known from day one, because we literally caught Axel, I don't like to use the expression, but red-handed. He was there. We had him with the knife and the little girls. So the idea that you could have prejudiced the trial is, I think, a little bit for the birds. But out of courtesy and respect for contempt, nobody did. But I think you could clearly have told a lot more about this, prepared the public for them, rather than dumping it all on them today, which is effectively what's happened. I mean, I like to call the victim impact statements the time when your heart breaks again, because we've been through all of this nonsense, and now that my heart is just breaking with these victim impact statements. It's It's unbelievable what they suffered. Can I say, Martin, can we please get an award for Leanne? Can we get her an honour? Can we get her? Can we make her a dame? Because she's. Did you hear her victim impact statement?
Yeah.
She blames herself. She's a hero. She saved children, and she blames herself. Can we just make this lady a dame, please, now? And John, who got stabbed, and the other lady who hid in the toilet, and the two window cleaners who came and helped people. That's what the honours system's for, not civil servants and, politicians like the mayor of London. Could we just please do something to help Leanne? Because she's obviously still tortured by this, and the nation cares about her. So do something.
Yeah, I absolutely.
I'm sort of begging you. do a GBNews campaign.
I absolutely. Well, we're not allowed to do that. But look, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and I think millions of people will concur. And I think in the fullness of time, when we all start to heal, that's the kind of conversation we'll be having. Stephen, I want to return to you later in the show because there's going to be a huge amount of conversation about what we do next. What we do next politically, what we do next in terms of this inquiry, what we do about prevent, what we do about changing potentially the laws around terms, tariffs, forcing people into the dock. But we'll do that later on in the show because Stephen Barrett, I'd love to come back to you for that. Thank you very much for joining us now. I'd like to bring in a very special guest now. I'm delighted to have the Southport charity leader, Mark Foreman, join us on the show now. Mark, through your GoFundMe page, you've raised an astonishing amount of money for the local community. I believe £70,000 to support the families and the children impacted. I really hope GB News viewers can help you get that figure up today because I know that GB News viewers care deeply and want to do something, anything, to feel they're having a positive impact. Mark, before we talk about what's going on today, could I ask you to go back in time and recall what happened and share with us, if you could, what drove you towards starting this incredible fundraiser?
Thanks, Martin. Interesting hearing Stephen's views a second ago. Looking back, it actually feels like I'm reliving it today because of the victim statements and everything that's coming out into the media. So back on the day itself, I was sitting where I am now, working from home as I would be normally, and I heard sirens, and then a helicopter. The Hart Street is the Hart Space is only less than a mile away from where I live here, so it's on our doorstep. My neighbour shouted to me across the doors were open because it was nice weather, and said there's been a stabbing in town, and she didn't know any more, but it might involve kids. So more sirens, more helicopters, and then more information came out to say that it was children. And through that, it was at the Hart Space, and it did involve kids. And I think the more we heard, the worse it got. We've got friends who were affected that day. The eldest girl was stabbed, and she led some of the younger children out and saved their lives. So both kids, the kids, Leanne, Heidi, anyone who survived and anyone who is related to anyone there, they're heroes. I mean, for what we did, all I did was put together a GoFundMe page. I mean, the Southport Hesketh Roundtable, I guess we're only famous for children in need, Pudsey going into schools, and the likes of a Mad Dog 10K run, and the Santa float going through town. We're not heroes, we're not saviours or anything else like that. We just put together a mechanism. So if people wanted to donate funds and money towards the families affected, so we put together the funds, and it's increased significantly over the last 5 months. We've distributed pretty much 98% of the funds, because they keep topping up every now and again, to the 24 families, and they use those funds, those donations, for any way they see fit, whether or not that's extra additional therapy. It could be going away for the weekends. It could be anything. It could be financially supporting them if they're self-employed. I think, speaking to a few of them, they want to build new memories. So they'll do something with the kids, something that detracts them, takes them away from the area or from memories and stuff that they want to forget about for the Hart Space. And I mean, through what we do for the round table, where we raise funds, we're part of the community, and we do as much as we possibly can to help our community, to help our neighbours, to help our friends and our family. And no matter what we can do, it feels to me that it's not enough, and we need to do more. And I'm so upset of how this trial has gone, what this guy is doing, and I won't even say his name out. It just disgusts me. And the people, the survivors, these families, and my friends. I mean, they're all heroes. And you know, as Stephen mentioned a second ago, there should be honour lists and for people, survivors and stuff, because they're living with this tragedy every single day. They're living with their memories, and it's not nice. It's horrible, and they'll never ever forget it. They just have to deal with it like grief. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's pretty much it.
Mark, I think what you've done is astonishing. I think it's beautiful. I think you say you're not a hero. I know you're being humble, but you know what you've done is exemplified the very, very best of what humanity does when it faces its darkest moments. You know, you try and come together, you raise money, and just the notion that a few quid could help one of these kids, the survivors who were not even allowed to name because of court orders. You know, they're trying to rebuild their lives. Anybody who was in there that day who witnessed this, the impact testimonies we're hearing about how this individual had crazed demonic eyes and only had one thing on his mind, to put a wrecking ball through the innocence of childhood in that way, to have any hope of moving on, the simple act of allowing people to build new memories and to build new happiness and to help this darkest moment to become something hopefully positive, I think is incredible. I really do. You've raised 70 grand so far and counting. We want to try and get that up. I'll do the best I can to give this a big shove through my social medias. And GB News viewers now, who I know are a generous mob, GB News viewers have helped the elderly, they've helped pensioners, they've helped farmers. How can people get involved and get a few quid your way, Mark, for them, and tell them what they got to do?
Apart from the GoFundMe page, just supporting us, and go on and take a look at our Facebook page. We're just a group of guys who meet up a couple of times a month. We are praying for new members at the moment. So if anyone feels as though that they're lonely or struggling, please reach out. And you know, we meet up twice a month. I think the next one we're doing indoor skydiving or something. I mean, do whatever you can. I mean, just help and support wherever necessary. And let's just hope that the families can grieve more after today.
And Mark, just to help people if they're not watching, if you're listening on the radio at home, the GoFundMe is called Helping the Southport Families after the 29th of July 2024 attack. And Mark Foreman, I'm delighted to say, in the last few minutes alone, we've raised a couple of £1,000. It's going up. I don't know how that makes you feel. It's making me choked. One of the things I find astonishing about Britain in these darkest hours is that people want to be a part of something, and they want to feel like they're a force for good, and they want to feel like even if they give a cup of tea or a pint of beer in terms of the money, it can help to make a difference, because all of us feel so powerless at times like this. We feel like the forces are too great. We feel like the law isn't really on our side sometimes. We feel like everything is spiraling out of control, and people need to cling on to some driftwood of hope. And that's what you've done, Mark.
Thank you. It's not just me, it's my team of guys. And, you know, over the Christmas time with the Santa float, we were out there, rain, shine, snow, sleet, everything. And I mean, we normally do the Hart Street route as well. And we're famous in Southport for dancing Santa. So Santa dances on the back of the truck and the trailer. And we spread as much joy and happiness as possible. And I'll tell you, the night we went down Hart Street, you know, Santa shed a tear, and it was the best that we could possibly do for our community.
I'm just sat here with our political editor, Chris Hope, who's got your GoFundMe open, and it's going like a fruit machine. People are really chucking in. Let's read out a few of these names. These people are amazing. Maria Bradbury has just thrown in 200 quid. Kim E. Dwyer, 20 quid. Paula Janis has put £50 in. Austin King, £10. Kevin Taylor, £10. Miriam Glynn, 20 quid. Linda Miller, £10. Kathy Driver, £50. Alan Malpass, £15. This is happening in real time. Paula Bailey, £5. Graham Wood, £5. Claire Ann Huggett, £10. Mitchell Thraves, £10. Claire Nicholson, £5. Jill Burns, £10. Maria Filer, £100. Ian Lenny, £5. I could go on and on and on. This is happening in real time. People are listening and people care. And isn't that amazing that people feel like by chucking if it's 200 quid, if it's 5 quid, it's gone up to £83,000 and £805. It's gone up from 70,000 to 83,000. It's gone up £10,000 while we've been on air. Mark.
It's more than making me smile. It's something I think is melting me inside. And I can just say that any of these funds, all of these donations, they're all going to these families. And the families are building new memories and doing whatever they can to survive. So it all helps, and I appreciate everybody who's donating. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll tell you what, mate. You've certainly touched the hearts of people watching this show today, and expect a donation from a certain Mr. Martin Daubney later on. I'll be chucking a few quid your way, and I just want to say thank you, for restoring faith in humanity on a day when, good God above, we need it. Mark Foreman, you're a legend. Thank you very much. To repeat again, the Helping the Southport Families after the 29th of July 2024 attack. You can donate via GoFundMe. We raised over £10,000 out. It's on your screens. Thank you, everybody, you amazing people who are... We've just raised 12,000 quid just in the time there where Mark Foreman has been on air, and I feel like weeping with happiness. And I didn't think I'd be feeling like that today, Mark. I really, really didn't.
Thank you.
Thank you, mate. You deserve every penny, and every penny raised can go to those families to help them rebuild. And I can tell this has taken its toll on you in the community in its time, but the sunlight coming through the clouds for you here, Mark, is that people want to help you. They want to get involved. They want to make a difference, and you're the guy that's allowed them to do that. So absolutely thank you very, very much, and I'll continue to boost that later on in the day. Mark Foreman, absolute legend. Thank you very, very much for joining us today on GB News.
Thank you.
Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? I just find that beautiful. OK, let's go back now to GB News' home and security editor, Mark White, who's outside Liverpool Crown Court. Mark, welcome back. What's the latest?
Well, the latest is we are now advancing with this sentencing hearing. The mitigation is underway with the defence for Axel Rudakabana saying that there is little in the way of mitigation that they can actually suggest, given the wicked nature of the crimes committed by this 18-year-old, 17-year-old at the time. And in fact, the defence said for actions of such wickedness, there is not much mitigation I can offer. Most significant mitigating factor is perhaps that he was 17 years of age when he committed these horrific offences. He also, the defence lawyer, is a barrister, I should say, for Axel Rudakabana, saying that this man's maturity is lagging behind what it should be for his age. So those are some of the mitigating factors that the barrister is trying to put forward. We've heard from the judge as well, despite the fact that this man was only just a week or so away from his 18th birthday. He was 17 at the time of the murders and the stabbings, and that means that a whole life sentence is not available. The judge confirming a whole life sentence is not available to him. and instead, of course, they are looking at other options, the aggravating factors of this case. And as you discussed them there, Martin, the planning, the intent with which this individual sought out this particular dance class, went and carried out the most horrific attack, the harm that he inflicted on so many people. If this was an adult, these whole life sentences are rare, but there is no doubt at all he would be receiving a whole life sentence. So the judge is going to have to look at what he can, taking into consideration that he pleaded guilty, that Axel Rudakabana pleaded guilty just before the start of the trial. That would normally mean a credit, a discount in the sentence handed down, but the prosecutor in this case is urging the judge not to give any significant credit at all to Axel Rudakabana, who pleaded guilty at the last possible opportunity because of the so many aggravating factors, not least, of course, the number of times these young girls were stabbed by this individual in that frenzied, manic attack. That those aggravating factors should far outweigh any potential credit that he might receive, Martin. So the judge will have to take that on board. It's discussion at the moment. Then we'll move to the sentencing proper. Likely, I think, that there might be a short break. But having said that, right, sentencing now, I can confirm Sophie Reaper inside the courtroom at Liverpool Crown Court, doing such sterling work for us, listening to all of this harrowing evidence, confirming to us here on GB News that the sentencing of Axel Rudakabana is now underway. The judge's remarks, I thought perhaps, given the length of time that proceedings have been ongoing, we might have had a short break for the judge to then begin his sentencing.
OK, let's cross now. Thank you, Mark White. In fact, let's cross now direct to Liverpool Crown Court, where Judge Justice Goose is beginning sentencing.
On the 29th of July last year, Rudakabana left home and travelled by taxi to the Hart Space in Hart Street, Southport, armed with a large kitchen knife which he had bought on the internet on the 13th of July, 16 days earlier. He knew that there was to be a Taylor Swift-themed yoga and dance workshop where very young girls, mostly aged between 6 and 11, were to enjoy an organised party safely in an upstairs room where the organisers were to look after him. There were 26 children in the party, all of them happy and enjoying themselves. It started at about 9:30 that morning on a warm summer's day, but he had targeted those very young children for the horrific extreme violence he was intent upon. At 11:45 that morning, he arrived and walked straight into the building, up the stairs to where he could hear the sound of happy children. In his mind was the intention to murder as many of them as he physically could. He wanted to try and carry out mass murder of innocent, happy young girls. And over about 15 minutes, he savagely killed 3 of them and attempted to kill 8 more, as well as 2 adults who tried to stop him. It was of such extreme violence, of the utmost and exceptionally high seriousness, that it is difficult to comprehend why it was done. I am sure that Rudakabana had a settled and determined intention to carry out these offences, and that had he been able to, he would have killed each and every child, all 26 of them, as well as any adults who got in his way. It was only because some managed to escape that prevented many more from being murdered. I am also sure that after the other children, 8 of whom he had very seriously injured, managed to escape, it left him in the upstairs room and landing, where he returned to continue his sustained and brutal violence against 2 of the youngest of those children, stabbing them multiple times. That demonstrated how determined he was to cause the maximum suffering he could. Left alone with them where they'd fallen, he continued shocking and extreme violence. Many who have heard the evidence summarised by the prosecution in this hearing, and having seen the CCTV recordings played with a view from the outside of the building, might describe what he did as evil. Who could dispute it? But on any view, it was at least the most extreme, shocking and exceptionally serious crime. In describing the injuries caused to each of the victims, I will summarise the evidence, being conscious that the families of Elsie Stankham, B.B. King and Alice de Silva Aguiar are in court, as are the families of each of the other victims. It's necessary, however, in sentencing, briefly to refer to the injuries. Elsie Stankham was aged only 7 when Rudikabana inflicted at least 85 sharp force injuries to her head, face, neck, torso and upper limbs. Severe force was used to cause her death. B.B. King was aged only 6 when he inflicted at least 122 sharp force injuries to her head, face, neck, torso and upper limbs. It was the opinion of Dr. Seeker, the pathologist, that Rudikabana had tried to decapitate her. He concluded that severe force was used to kill her. Alice de Silva Aguiar was aged 9 when he stabbed her, including a chop wound to her head and 4 stab wounds to her back, causing substantial internal injury. Although she managed to escape out of the building, she collapsed, and despite all medical help, she died in hospital at 1:20 in the morning the following day.
Yeah, you can see now that the cameras in court have been suspended for legal reasons, and that's probably because the evidence is so graphic, and also because, of course, there are people who survived that attack who, for legal reasons, there's a court order, cannot be named. But just to go over some of the information we heard there from Mr. Justice Goose, who's sentencing now Axel Rudikabana, the triple Southport child killer. He said this was violence of the very worst nature imaginable. He went on, had he been able to, he'd have killed each and every one of those 26 children and all of the adults. He added, who can dispute that this was evil? He then went into some of the more graphic evidence of the numbers of sharp injuries to the children who died, the 3 children who died, 122 injuries to one, 85 to another, stab wounds to the back and chop wounds. The most incredible piece of information there, the most distressing, and I should warn you, this is deeply distressing, of BB. The coroner concluded he tried to decapitate her. This is just the most savage and brutal attack possibly imaginable. The evidence has been deemed too graphic for legal reasons. That's the reason we've had to come off of that feed. It's not our choice. It's because it is what the lawyers, the law of the land, has concluded. Let's go to Mark White. Mark, you listened into that. I listened into that. We suspected this may happen. The information simply too graphic, and the danger, of course, of identifying those still protected by court orders. But what we did hear there, Mark, was utterly chilling.
Yes, well, and the judge, acknowledging, of course, that family members were in court, said that nonetheless he had to go to touch on at least some of the injuries suffered there, and of course then went into clearly what are very graphic evidence and descriptions of what happened to the 3 girls that lost their lives. Now, the reason we've not cut away, or the feed has been temporarily suspended from court, is because the girls who were injured, 8 girls who were injured, have anonymity orders, but we can go back to court now.
deep wound as he tried to kill him. I have read each of the victim's personal statements, and many have been read out to the court. They are all deeply moving. The harm that Ruda Cabana has caused to each family, each child, and to the community has been profound and permanent. For the families of Elsie, Bibi and Alice, they will never recover from what happened to their daughter. For those children and the adults that he attempted to murder, their lives will never be the same, nor will their families who are left to look after their exceptionally brave daughters. Also for the emergency services whose personnel had to deal with the aftermath. In just under 15 minutes, Ruda Cabana murdered 3 children, attempted to murder 8 other children, and also 2 adults. He was prevented from murdering more only by the escape of the other children. When the police arrived at about 12 noon, they found him standing over the body of B.B. King and still holding the knife. It was B.B. who had suffered at least 122 separate knife wounds. He was arrested, taken into custody, and whilst Ruda Cabana did not say anything in his police interviews, he did make unsolicited comments which are deeply disturbing, including, quote, "I'm glad to see those kids are dead. It makes me happy," close quote, and, quote, "It's a good thing those children are dead," close quote. In his home, the police discovered clear evidence of a settled intention to carry out mass killing. On one of his computers were files proving that he had a long-standing preoccupation with violent killing and genocide. Of particular significance were copies of an Al-Qaeda training manual, which described methods of killing with a knife and where to attack the victim. Part of it referred to attacking the head and neck, just as he had done to some of the victims in this case. Also, the manual provided instruction on how to produce ricin, a highly dangerous toxin, which can cause multiple deaths and has no known antidote. I am sure that he had followed those instructions because the police found in his bedroom the materials to produce ricin and a pulp residue within a container. That was examined by an expert in chemical and biological warfare agents, Dr. Martin Pierce, and confirmed it was ricin pulp and castor oil. His opinion was that there was sufficient ricin pulp that with some further purification process it would have provided a range of up to 1,269 doses, which would cause death if inhaled. However, there was no evidence that Ruda Cabana had recently tried purification. I am satisfied that for some time he had planned to kill as many people as he could, as the prosecution have called it, quotes, "a mass killing." He bought the knife he wanted to use, which had a particularly sharp point. He had read information on how to stab people with greatest effect to kill them. He saw the publicity for a children's party in Southport at the Heart Space Dance Studio and decided to kill as many as he could, targeting very young children. I'm also satisfied that if he hadn't decided that way of killing, in time he was highly likely to use the ricin he had produced. The prosecution have made it clear that these proceedings were not acts of terrorism within the meaning of the terrorism legislation, because there is no evidence that Ruda Cabana's purpose was to advance political, religious, racial or ideological cause. I must accept that conclusion. However, in my judgment, his culpability for this extreme level of violence is equivalent in its seriousness to terrorist murders, whatever his purpose. Whether his motivation was for terrorism or not misses the point. What he did on the 29th of July last year has caused such shock and revulsion to the whole nation that it must be viewed as being at the very extreme level of crime. His culpability and the harm he caused and intended were at the highest. I do not, however, take into account against him what happened in different parts of the country after his arrest. He did not cause that. Axel Ruda-Cabana was born in Cardiff on the 7th of August of 2006. He's a UK citizen, now aged 18, but was still 17 when he committed these offences. He was only 9 days short of his 18th birthday, which has a particular significance. Had he been 18, I make it clear that I would have been compelled to impose on him life imprisonment without a minimum term, otherwise known as a whole life term, meaning that he would never be released. However, the law does not permit such a sentence for those offenders who are under 18 when they offend. Ruda-Cabana has only one previous conviction, on the 19th of February 2020, when he was aged 13, for possession of a knife on school premises, assault and possession of an offensive weapon in a public place. He was made subject to a juvenile referral order. Those offences took place when he returned to the school from which he'd been excluded due to his previous behaviour. He entered the school without permission, carrying a knife and hockey stick, intent on attacking another pupil, whom he said had bullied him. For the offence of murder on counts 1, 2 and 3, the sentence must be custody for life. I am required to fix the minimum term which he must serve in custody before he may apply to the parole board for his release. It will be for the board to decide if he is ever safe to be released into the community, and if ever he is, he will remain on licence for the rest of his life, subject to recall into custody if he breaches his licence terms. The minimum term I will fix will be a very substantial one, and the very least he will be detained, which will mean that he will serve almost the whole of his life in custody. I consider at this time that it is likely he will never be released, and that he will be in custody for all his life. The starting point in deciding the minimum term in custody on counts 1 to 3 must be 27 years, because he was 17 years old when he murdered Elsie, Bibi and Alice. I find the following circumstances make those murders yet more serious. Firstly, there are two exceptionally high factors that would, but for his age, require me to impose a whole life term. The murder of 2 or more persons where each murder involved a substantial degree of premeditation or planning, and it was in each case the murder of a child with such premeditation or planning. Secondly, the children were particularly vulnerable because of their very young age, being 7, 6 and 9 respectively. Thirdly, the physical suffering that he caused as he repeatedly stabbed them. Fourthly, there were 3 murders. Fifthly, at the time he carried out these murders, he also attempted to kill 10 more, 8 of whom were also very young children. Sixthly, the severity of the injuries caused to the victims. Seventhly, he produced highly toxic poison ricin, which he was very likely to use at some time had he not committed these offences. In mitigation for this offending, Ruda-Cabana is still only 18 years old. However, I consider that his age has already provided him with a substantial reduction in his sentence, because it means that he has avoided a whole life term. Whilst he has entered guilty pleas, saving the families and victims the pain of a trial, he cannot claim to have shown any remorse. His unsolicited comments in the police station made clear his feelings. However, lack of remorse is not an aggravating factor. I have read evidence within a statement of an assistant head teacher which describes how Ruda-Cabana's early years at school developed from a normal student to one who became increasingly threatening to those he felt had wronged him, leading to his exclusion. None of this gives any indication of what he was to do on the 29th of July last year. I have read the intermediary assessment report dated the 24th of September 2024, in which its author said that he presented as having high-functioning autism and that he does not have any associated learning disabilities. The report found that he had some communication and attention difficulties. None of this offered any explanation for this offending. No further expert evidence has been provided on his behalf. I've taken into account the overarching principles sentencing children and young people. The fact that he's now 18 years old does not make the guideline irrelevant. However, I'm not persuaded that his emotional age is different to his chronological age. I will give him the appropriate discount to reflect the fact that whilst almost 18, he was still young. In sentencing, I will impose concurrent sentences, meaning they will all be served at the same time. However, I will treat the murder offences in counts 1 to 3 as the lead offences and take into account all of the total offending when fixing the minimum term of custody he must serve. Also, I have in mind the totality of the sentences, requiring me to take a step back and consider whether they are just and proportionate, and I conclude that they are. The guilty pleas will allow some small discount on the sentence because they were entered so late, on the first day of the trial. I turn to the attempted murder offences in counts 4 to 13. Each of these offences requires me to impose concurrent sentences of custody for life under section 272 of the Sentencing Act 2020. Each offence is within Schedule 19 of the Act. I am satisfied in the circumstances of these offences that Rudy Cabana is a dangerous offender and that the circumstances justify the imposition of a life sentence. I must then fix the custodial term which he must serve. For each of the offences where he attempted to murder a child, being counts 4 to 11, the appropriate sentence guideline is category A2 with a starting point for sentence of 30 years and a range up to 35 years. The very young age of each victim and the substantial planning by him requires me to increase that sentence to the top of the range before reducing it to reflect his age, his late guilty plea, and to reach the minimum term for these offences. Accordingly, I firstly reduce the sentence to 30 years for his age and 27 years for the guilty plea, leading to a minimum term of 18 years on each of counts 4 to 11 concurrently. On counts 12 and 13, which are attempted murder of the adults, Leanne Lucas and Jonathan Hayes, the guideline category is B2 with a starting point of 25 years and a range up to 30 years. With the same aggravating factors of seriousness and mitigation for counts 4 to 11, I increase the sentence to 30 years before reducing it to 27 years for age and to 24 years for guilty plea, leading to a minimum term on those two counts of 16 years concurrently. I now turn to the remaining counts. On count 14, having an article with a blade, the sentence is 18 months custody. This is a category 1A offence for which I have reduced the sentence to reflect his age and plea. Count 15, production of a biological toxin. There is no offence-specific sentence guideline. I've been assisted by reference to the case of the Crown against Mohammed Ammar Ali, 2016 EWCA Crim 864, in which a sentence of 8 years imprisonment after conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeal, a decision based upon its own facts. I'm satisfied that his production in this case of ricin was more advanced and is associated with Rudy Cabana's mindset to cause many killings, whilst he had not used the ricin by the time of his arrest, taking into account his culpability and the harm risked, allowing for his age and guilty plea, I sentence him concurrently to 12 years custody. Count 16, possession of a document likely to be useful to a person preparing an act of terrorism. The sentence is 18 months custody after taking into account his age and plea and applying the guideline category 3C. I'm now going to sentence Axel Rudy Cabana, having explained my reasons. On counts 1 to 3 murder, I sentence him to custody for life with a minimum term which he must serve in custody of 52 years, less the time he's served already. He's been in custody for 175 days on remand, which will be credited. Therefore, the minimum term is 51 years and 190 days. On counts 4 to 11, I sentence him concurrently to custody for life with a minimum term of 18 years, less 175 days served, on each count concurrently with each other. Allowing for his time served on remand, the minimum term on those counts is 17 years and 190 days. On counts 12 and 13, I sentence him concurrently to custody for life with a minimum term of 16 years, less his time served on remand, on each count concurrently with each other, leading to a minimum term on those counts of 15 years and 190 days. On counts 14 and 16, I sentence him to 18 months custody concurrently with each other and all other offences. He will pay the appropriate amount under he will pay the appropriate amount under 18 statutory charge, which will be entered on the court record. Accordingly, in total, I sentence Rudy Cabana to 13 sentences of custody for life and a minimum term to be served in custody of 51 days and 190 days. It is highly likely that he will never be released.
Wow. Well, that was quite the sentence. Astonishing. The total sentence there, handed down by Mr. Justice Goose at Liverpool Crown Court to Axel Rudakabana, was 51 years and 190 days on counts 1 to 3. That's the murder of the 3 children. Was life with a minimum of 52 years minus time served, 175 days, 51 years and 190 days. And the lesser sentences will be kind of superfluous because the one there, the chief case, 51 years, 190 days. Let's go straight back now to our Homeland Security editor, Mark White, who's been valiantly outside Liverpool Crown Court all day. Mark White, justice has been served, and the justice, has to be said, has been served firm.
Yes, a very significant sentence, bearing in mind that the judge did not have the option of effectively jailing this man for the rest of his life. Now, at 52 years, the minimum tariff, of course, then also subject of that deduction of 190 days for the time already served, down to 51 years effectively. He could still be eligible for parole at the age of 69, but what the judge said is, in reality, he believes that Axel Cabana will die in prison, that he will never be released, because just because you're eligible for parole doesn't necessarily mean that the parole board will grant that particular release, that parole, back into the community. But very disturbing and harrowing evidence from the judge in his sentencing remarks, as he detailed the terrible injuries suffered in particular by the 3 young girls murdered by Axel Rudakabana, and also, of course, that startling insight into the ricin, the deadly toxin that this young man had produced in his own home, a quantity of which was sufficient, according to the judge, that had it been refined, it could have killed thousands. And he said he was in no doubt that had the plot to attack these young girls and kill as many as possible in Southport failed, he would have resorted to Plan B, the plan to launch this biological weapons attack and kill as many people as possible. Well, Martin, there is new video that we've been talking about all day that we can now bring to you, released from the criminal justice system, the court service. I've been looking back at this very disturbing case.
That's it, yeah, it's down there. Down there.
In the back of a local taxi, this is Southport killer Axel Rudakabana, just moments before he shattered the innocence of a children's dance class in the most horrific way imaginable. There would be no payment for the driver from this violence-obsessed teenager as he suddenly jumps out of the taxi, making his way towards the entrance of the Heart Space venue. It's so incredibly heartbreaking to watch these images, as in the background, music can clearly be heard from the Taylor Swift-themed dance class inside, as the youngsters here had no idea of the evil about to enter their world. 3 of those innocents were murdered. 8 others and 2 adults injured in a sustained stabbing attack that left even the most experienced first responders completely traumatised.
You know, the events that took place on the 29th of July last year were just truly horrific. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. You know, whilst we've heard the sentencing this week of Axel Rudikabana, which is positive, you know, my thoughts remain with the families of Elsie, Bibi and Alice, the other girls and adults that were injured, and those that have been traumatised by what they saw on that day. Just truly horrific.
This is the same model as the chef's knife Rudikabana bought on Amazon and used in the attack. Although he refused to speak to investigators, he was overheard on an audio recording muttering to himself in police custody, saying he was glad the young girls were dead and satisfied he'd achieved what he set out to do. Multiple failings by state agencies have only served to compound the grief and the anger of the bereaved families and the wider community. Aged just 13, this twisted and violent young man began taking knives to school. He admitted to doing this on 10 separate occasions. He openly bragged of his desire to carry out a school massacre. But despite 3 separate referrals to the Prevent Counter-Extremism programme, no action was taken.
Axel Rudikabana first became known to Children's Social Care in 2019, following referrals from the police into the multi-agency Safeguarding Hub. A strategy discussion, which is a multi-agency meeting involving key professionals, in this case social work, early help, police, health and education, met to plan actions and share information following the attack that took place in the school.
This is Rudikabana near his Lancashire home a week before the Southport attack, calling a taxi with the likely intention of carrying out an attack at his former high school. His father intervened and begged the taxi driver not to drive him there. It's not known exactly what his family knew about his attack plans and whether any of them could face prosecution. But at the family home, police discovered paraphernalia used by the teenager to make the deadly biological toxin ricin, a quantity of which was found in this Tupperware box. A PDF document with information linked to an Al-Qaeda training manual was also found within days of the attack. Yet it took 3 months before authorities finally revealed to the public he would also face a terror charge and biological weapons charge. Those charges came months after the widespread disorder, fueled by anger and suspicion that the public were not being told key facts about the suspect. The Prime Minister and others have admitted facts were withheld. Police said they wanted to reveal more information to help counter public misinformation, but were prevented from doing so by the Crown Prosecution Service. The CPS said to do otherwise could have led to the collapse of the case.
We felt that the risk of putting any detailed information, more than we put out already, could prejudice that fair trial. And given that our priority was to make sure that justice was done, that's where we made the decisions that we did.
Axel Rudikabana is now firmly behind bars, having shown absolutely no remorse. Bereaved families will never fully recover, and public trust in the authorities to tell them the truth in future has been badly dented. Mark White, GB News, Merseyside. And just to reiterate, that sentence handed down to Axel Rudikabana, a minimum term of 52 years, discounted, of course, for the 190 days he's already served behind bars, so just over 51 years. He could be eligible for parole at the age of 69, but the judge said, in all likelihood, he will die behind bars. Well, let's introduce now our correspondent in the Northwest, Sophie Reaper. You've been inside court all day doing sterling work for us, listening to the most horrific of evidence here. And you saw again this man just continue to defy the court system and to shout out and scream.
Absolutely. Obviously, this morning we reported that there were slight delays to the proceedings because it seemed Axel Rudicabarna was refusing to come up to the dock. He did eventually, and as we discussed earlier, he initially was silent, head in his hands, as we've seen him previously, but then he started to shout and scream at the prosecution and Justice Goose telling him he was ill and that he had chest pains, that he needed to see a paramedic. Eventually he was removed, but Justice Goose expressed that he wanted him to be brought back to the court this afternoon. However, he did appear this afternoon once again in the dock. I think court proceedings went on for perhaps 1 or 2 minutes maximum before the defendant, Axel Rudicabarna, once again began shouting. He was ill, he needed to be seen by medical professionals. I should say, he was looked at by medical professionals, we heard in the court. One confirmed that he was well to continue, although he wanted a second opinion. That second opinion was received, and again it was confirmed that he was well to continue hearing this sentencing proceedings today. But as I say, 2 minutes in, he continued to shout and scream, and the judge just immediately ordered him to be removed. We came to the sentencing remarks, and the defence told the judge that Rudicabarna expressed that if he were to be forced to come back to the dock, that he would simply continue to cause disruptions.
So absolutely the best decision of the judge not to have him in there for the sake of the families.
Yes.
When that sentence was handed down, that minimum term of what will effectively be 51 years behind bars, any reaction from those families in court, Sophie?
Yes, absolutely. The reaction was palpable, particularly for Alice De Silva Aguiar's family, her mother and father who were in there. You could just immediately see the relief on their faces. Of course, they still have to live the rest of their lives knowing that their only daughter had been taken away from them, but to know that her killer will now, as the judge said, effectively spend the rest of his life behind bars, I think that sense of relief. And also when we came out of the courtroom there, families, they were hugging, they were crying, obviously, but you could feel that palpable sense of relief. I think for many of them, they were building to this week thinking there was going to be a full criminal trial, and then they were left confused, they were left upset by the fact that actually last minute he changed his plea to guilty, and it just caused this real sense of discombobulation. So I think the fact that it is now over, they can go back to their homes, they can go back to their family and loved ones, knowing that that man who has shown such contempt, not only for them but for the process today, that he will spend, as you say, just over 51 years behind bars, likely the rest of his life, that they will find some kind of relief and some sense of justice in that.
Well, we could only hope so. And you mentioned, of course, the family of Alice De Silva Aguiar, the father, Sergio, shouting out "coward" as he left the court for the first time after an outburst. And you've had to sit through these very traumatising victim impact statements, in particular, of course, one from Alice's family and the father talking about the absolute devastation that her death has brought.
I think one line that really stuck with me from the statement of Alice's family was that they were planning on surprising her with a trip to Disneyland that summer, and that was a trip that they never got to take. And I think for all of our viewers at home, for everyone listening, a trip to Disneyland for a 9-year-old little girl would be the thing of dreams, and realising and recognising that that poor little girl instead went to something that should have been a really happy start to her summer holidays, that she never got to take that trip to Disneyland. I think that is something that will really stick. And another line from that as well, there was that they loved cooking together, and that they said, "We used to cook for 3, we now cook for 2." They remembered her as a fun, happy little girl that she would come home and she would say, "Hola, Mummy, hola, Papi," and they had a family routine of saying, "See you later, alligator," "In a while, crocodile," and those are things that I think any normal person can relate to and will find it devastating, as it was in the courtroom when we heard those particular comments, to think, and it really just gives a sense of the loss that family will be feeling.
But it's so good that you're able to attach the humanity to what we've seen in such a barbaric act perpetrated by this man, the lives that these girls had, the lives that thankfully those who survived this attack can go on and live. I was particularly struck, I have to say, by the victim impact statement from Leanne Lucas, who was one of the adults who survived, badly injured herself. And I mean, it was just heartbreaking.
When she said, I don't know how I can be expected to survive when children died, that I think really struck a chord with the entire room, because I think that sense of guilt. We also heard from one of the other women, a member of staff who'd hidden in a toilet, that she felt such guilt and that she felt she would never be trusted to work with children again. Of course, it's not their fault, but I think that survivor's guilt will remain with them forever, and that is something that is just horrendous, isn't it? It's one of those other consequences that perhaps initially no one thought of, but going on with their lives now, it is something they are going to have to consider. I think something else that really struck a chord with me was one of the mothers talks about how her daughter says to her on a really regular basis, "Mummy, when will my scars disappear?" Of course, those scars never will disappear, but she talks about how every day, 3 times a day, they treat those scars. So the hopes that one day her daughter, when she wears a wedding dress or when she buys her 18th birthday dress, whatever it may be, that those scars will have faded just a little bit, just to give her daughter that bit of confidence and to try, if at all possible, to move away from this horrific thing that has affected those families.
Yeah, I mean, it really is heartbreaking, but I think one of the more positive aspects from the victim impact statements was the determination from some of these young girls in the statements that they made, defiant really to Axel Rudikabana.
Yes.
To him, that he would not end or ruin their lives, that they would go on to live the most amazing and fruitful lives.
I think, first of all, with that, it's really important to reiterate that although several of them addressed Axel Rudikabana directly, that he was not in the room, that he did not hear those victim impact statements, and I think that is something that is really going to create quite a bit of anger. But also, I think one of the statements we heard from one of the girls who must remain anonymous because of her age, she said right at the end of her statement, and I just want to read this out, directly to Axel Rudikabana, "I want you to know that you changed mine and my sister's lives forever, but whilst you live behind bars alone, I will make sure that my sister and I and our family will do our best to move forward with our lives." And that is a child who is saying that. The courage, the bravery, the strength that she has shown, it's incomprehensible, it's unbelievable that she has gone through. You can't even put into words how terrifying that experience must have been. She recalled thinking the panic, the blind panic of not knowing where her younger sister was, or of thinking that she was running for her life. She said that was the feeling, I'm running to survive. To then come away from that and to be able to say, not directly to the killer because he didn't have the courage, certainly not her level of courage, to face them, but to say, while you live behind bars, we will continue with our lives. I think that sums up what one of the other parents said about his daughter, that she is brave, she is courageous, the polar opposite of Axel Rudikabana, and that's it, isn't it? These families have now got to try and pick up the pieces. He's been sentenced. The judge said it's likely he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. The families have lost so much, have been devastated, but they now have to try and pick up the pieces and move on with their lives as best they possibly can.
And of course the judge in his sentencing remarks taking into account the aggravating factors, the fact that he had set out in advance, he had planned this.
Yes.
He had targeted these girls in particular. He had wanted to kill as many girls as possible, and the number of times that he stabbed these girls was just horrific as well. And the judge, cognizant of the fact that the families of these girls, some of them decided to come back into court and listen to that, but the judge felt it was important to get that information out there, Sophie. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the comments the judge made was about that premeditation, that he was going for the most vulnerable in society, and he added, had Axel been able to, he would have killed all of the children, all 26 of them. And that just says so much, doesn't it? That if he would have been able to carry on, if there wouldn't have been intervening factors,
he would have killed all 26 of those little girls in the room. And the judge added the adults as well. Leanne Lucas, of course, who was in the room, tried to protect as many of those children as she could. She also received stab wounds that will change her life forever. And I think that that's just something that really just sticks, doesn't it? That if he could have done, he would have gone into that room where there was fun, there was laughter, there was music. He would have gone in with that 20-centimetre blade and he would have killed everyone that came across his path. And that is just an incomprehensible level of evil, isn't it? And I think there's anger here today, certainly, still, when we heard Alice's father shout that he was a coward. That I mean, it's understandable. But I think there's anger, but there's also a real sense of relief. Perhaps finally now that he has been sentenced, all these months later, the families will have a bit of respite. They'll maybe be able to carry on with their lives the best they can.
As he rots behind bars, indeed. The judge as well pointing out that the seriousness of the crimes that Axel Ridicabana committed were as serious as the most serious terror attack. So regardless of the motivation, the allegiance or otherwise of Axel Ridicabana, this was as serious as any terror attack in the eyes of the judge, and that's why, of course, he's gone for such a very heavy minimum term. Interesting, I found, Sophie, the detail about the ricin toxin and the fact that there was enough toxin produced that, had it been refined, thousands of people would have died. This was to be his plan B.
That very well could have been the case. In fact, Justice Goose saying it was highly likely to use the ricin he had produced if he would have been able to. And isn't that just a terrifying thought, that mass murder was so on the mind of this 17-year-old? Now, of course, when giving the mitigating factors, the defence said that his age is the primary mitigating factor, but also perhaps that his maturity was behind what it should be for a person of that age. But the judge simply seemed to say that really has no impact. What it does say is that he lacked empathy, perhaps, but realistically, this was a young man who had mass murder in his mind. We heard details, for example, of how he'd rung Childline back in, I think it was 2019, and asked, what do I do if I want to kill somebody? And that was, of course, many years ago. I think he was aged 13, perhaps then. He was also caught with a knife on him multiple occasions in various locations. This is a young man who was determined to kill. And from what the judge has said, it was a young man who was determined to attack the youngest, the most vulnerable in society. And that is just terrifying, isn't it?
And, of course, that is the next phase of where we go to. The criminal process is over, and I'm sure the families are very thankful for that, and thankful, of course, that the judge has handed down such a stiff sentence. But they have an ordeal ahead of them in this public inquiry, which will reveal in stark terms how many opportunities were missed by state agencies that should have been there. Their very reason for existing is to protect the community from dangerous people like this. Sophie, do you detect from the families that you've been speaking to, the reactions in court, that there is an appetite to really get to the bottom of these issues?
I would say so. I think many of the families have found it particularly difficult, and we discussed earlier some people perhaps criticising why the media haven't revealed all the graphic details. Now, the reason for that, as we said, is because some of the families weren't able to attend court today because they just felt they were unable to cope. I believe, I've just heard in my ear actually, Mark, that we can go live now to a statement from the Crown Prosecution Service outside the court steps.
No, it's just to say that we're waiting for the Crown Prosecution Service. We were likely to get reaction, of course,
yes,
from the police, potentially the Home Secretary as well. If not on camera, then maybe in some kind of statement that will come out, as they always do after cases like this, Sophie. So just to allow our audience, just to alert them to the fact that we are expecting these various organisations now, the Crown Prosecution Service and others, to give us their reaction to the sentence handed down. And of course, the CPS, well, they've got some questions to answer themselves, probably in the fullness of time with the likes of a public inquiry, because we've heard from Merseyside Police, not saying it in terms, but absolutely interpreted as we were gagged. We wanted to say more at the time that our riots were erupting around the country because of the misinformation that was swirling around the internet, that perhaps if they could have said more, it might have quelled some of the worst of the violence. So some difficult questions for the authorities going forward.
Absolutely. And just to go back to what we were saying, obviously the families who felt unable to attend because of those graphic details, I think going into that inquiry, there will be an appetite to have those questions answered on many, many levels, because of course we know that Axel Rudikabana was referred multiple times to the prevent system, and yet the attack was still able to take place. But I think also for those families, although they will be keen to have those questions answered, I think it is going to be an incredibly, incredibly difficult time for them.
Worth just touching as well, I think, on the new video, the new images that are out there now, as always happens with the conclusion of a case, and the authorities release some of the video that would have been used in the trial as such, and in particular the chilling images of this young man in the back of that taxi on his way. He knew where he wanted to go, Sophie.
He did, and that is something that's been discussed once again in court today when those that dashcam footage and CCTV were played out. We saw him in the back of the taxi and we heard him ask that taxi driver, "Where's 34A?" He knew the building he was going to. He knew where that dance class was taking place. The judge himself confirming in his sentencing remarks that Axel Rudikabana knew what he was doing that day. It was premeditated, it was planned. He knew who he was targeting.
And you saw other images, of course, which were just so deeply disturbing, of the girls that were, some of the girls running out of class, some of them bloodied and injured and panicked, and no emergency services there by that time. It was so early on in the incident. Just absolutely terrible that you had to sit through that. But as best you can you describe what you saw?
I want to start by saying that it was difficult, but I don't want to think about me today. I'm absolutely fine. It's the families and the victims that I really, really sympathise with because of the ordeal that they've had to endure. In terms of the footage, we saw that taxi that he travelled in. We saw the dashcam footage of Axel Rudikabana walking into the heart space, and about 20 to 30 seconds later, we heard the screams. Then just after that, other CCTV showed the girls fleeing for their lives. We also saw another little girl attempting to escape, and we see Axel Rudikabana pull her back in, which is just really incredibly harrowing. So in terms of that CCTV footage, that is incredibly difficult to watch, particularly for those families and victims. And there were very emotional reactions to that, as I'm sure you can imagine, in the court today.
Yeah, indeed. And Martin, I think for me, as clearly chilling and disturbing that the CCTV of these girls coming out was, actually it was the video of Axel Rudikabana just arriving at the Heart Space Centre outside, trying the door to get in. You could hear quite clearly in the background the music from Taylor Swift themed dance class inside. These children, no idea about what was just about to happen, that this evil individual was about to change their lives forever.
Thank you for that excellent summary there from Mark White and from Sophie Reaper, who'd been inside the court, listened to that harrowing evidence and relaying that to us outside today, some of which is simply too graphic, too harrowing to even repeat. But look, I want to cross now to Stephen Barrett, the barrister. We're waiting for the Crown Prosecution Service to come out there at Liverpool Crown Court to give a full press conference. Stephen, I wanted to come to you to ask if you feel justice has been served today. We started the day. A lot of people were very cross about the fact that Rudy Cabana couldn't face a full life term. And that is the scene outside Liverpool Crown Court there, Stephen Barrett. We are expecting a press conference imminently. But until then, I want to get your take on the term. Life term with a minimum of 52 years minus 175 days already served. Now, by my reckoning, that means Axel Rudy Cabana will not be eligible for parole or any form of release until Sunday, August the 2nd, 2076. Now, that is a lot of porridge. Do you feel that Rudy Cabana got his just desserts today?
I would like to take a moment, Martin, to reassure everybody that my faith in Mr. Justice Goose has been proved true. I mean, what a fantastic judge, and what a credit to our justice system he is. He did a number of things which I think non-lawyers might not notice, but he went immediately into sentencing. He didn't want to waste. He didn't want those families to suffer any more delay. They'd had to sit through it all, and so he just went straight through. Didn't need a break, didn't need to prepare himself. He'd obviously got on top of everything well before then, and he went straight off bat and sentenced. The total sentence is higher than I thought he would give, and I understand why now. The details are far worse than even I knew. So I think it's an entirely appropriate sentence, and I would be very surprised if it's challengeable. I'm sure it will be challenged because that is the way of the world, but I would be surprised if such a sentence could be challenged. Not least of all because of how brilliantly he did the summing up. I mean, I don't think he dropped a beat. I don't think he made a mistake. I don't think there's an appeal point there. I mean, it's for a criminal, lawyer to advise on that. But my view is that he's wrapped this one up, which is another mark of respect to the families, because you don't want them dragged through, this awful man having his sentence reduced. That said. And the other thing he did was say that this is terrorism, to stop the authorities running around with their nonsense, trying to pretend that this wasn't terrorism because of some technical definition of the definition of terrorism. Just go boil your heads, people. It's obviously terrorism, and he quite rightly got it. So again, my faith in Mr. Justice Goose, I think, absolutely, fulfilled. I'd never heard of him before this case, and I absolute credit to the judiciary, and I'm proud to be a barrister, when we have judges like this. And I always say we have the best in the world, and we clearly do. So I'm very, very proud of him. There is a risk. I'm concerned about the fact that the parole, the body that will make the decision on his release is the parole board. Okay, and I think I need to flag this to people. I think people need to pay attention to this. It's made a load of really bad decisions recently, letting out all sorts of people. It wasn't always their decision. It was only, I think, in the 90s or under Blair that they got the power to make the decision. It used to be with the minister, who you can hold to account, who you can drag onto a TV show, who you can question in the House. I've never seen a member of the parole board do a TV interview or be questioned anywhere. I mean, they probably report to the Justice Committee in some sense, but I doubt it's particularly onerous, and I doubt that they can be summoned at the drop of a hat. We need to go back to government by ministers, not quangos, because ministers can be held to account. And I don't think this young man should ever be let out. The judge doesn't. And the only risk in that is, and I don't think a Home Secretary of any party, in whatever the parties are 52 years from now, but I don't think a sitting Home Secretary of any party would ever release this man, ever, because the public scorn would be so great. The danger is the parole board. They don't seem to have any scrutiny. They don't answer to anybody, and they make really bad decisions. It's this idea, Martin, that we're better off governed by so-called experts, and I'm afraid it's just wrong.
OK, Stephen Barrett, a couple of things I picked up on, which, again, look, I agree. I think the public really, really needed to see that justice was served today. Because this notion, he's a minor, therefore he can't get the full force of the law. People were very, very anxious about the fact that once Again, as we saw with Valdo Calicane, the Nottingham triple killer, a feeling of soft justice, the mental health card being played, and I was particularly enlightened and helped today by the fact that, again, Mr. Justice Goose simply brushed that to one side. He said he analysed the mental capacity of Axel Rudakanu, and he said he showed no remorse, clearly premeditated. He was a normal student when he was younger, and he had high-functioning autism, but no evidence of learning difficulties. He wasn't convinced his mental age was less than his physical age, i.e. this individual had a full mental comparison, a full analysis, and none of it washed. So there's no chance to play a mental health card. There's no chance of diminished responsibility. There was no chance if I wasn't really aware what I was doing. The evidence was compelling, the analysis was thorough, and perhaps that now helps to explain why they went for the guilty plea. He was having none of it.
I think it certainly may well do. I'm just glad and take yet more pride in I don't deserve it because I didn't do it. He did the job. But, you know, in Mr. Justice Goose, I mean, what a marvellous representation of the power of justice, because justice must be seen to be muscular.
Yes.
It must be powerful. It's the one thing that really can't bend and be pushed over or be screamed at by a lunatic and then give in. You know, that it's the one time we do actually need our society to have boundaries and for those boundaries to matter. So I am terribly proud. I'm glad that he dealt with it that way. It's deeply disrespectful to people with autism. If anybody had tried to say, "Oh, he did it because he's," that's horrendous. There are loads of people who are on the autistic spectrum. They don't murder little children, you know. And so. I'm glad that we have robust judges in this country who deal with things properly, who don't fall for silly arguments, and who justly plough on ahead. Now, he did everything perfectly because he didn't rush anything. I don't think he's made a mistake. So this is really, I hope this reassures the public. I hope that people now have faith in their country. I've always thought, I've talked to you about how I think Keir Starmer was causative of the riots. And I do think if the public had got this sense much, much earlier on, which they could have done, a very eminent KC went on the telly to say that in reality there was no risk to this trial, and there was no risk to this trial because that judge would sit there going, "I don't think that tweet derails the trial," because we've seen him in action. Do you think Mr. Justice Goose is the type of person who jumps at a shadow and says that a Facebook post has ruined a trial? Don't believe it. Not having any of it. It would have been tosh. As long as the trial was in his hands, it was safe.
You know, Stephen Barrett, I think you're absolutely right. We had to see today that justice had been served. We have to see that everybody was equal before the law, and there was no way you could wriggle off the hook. Rudakabana was up for it. He got what he deserved today. And you're right to bring in the fact that there was a feeling that people who took part in the protests were all banded in as far right. You remember that ridiculous time where the Crown Prosecution Service put out criminals on those pictures of people who hadn't yet even been convicted for taking part in those trials. In fact, one of them was a 13-year-old girl, a 13-year-old girl's parents, who I've spoken to in the aftermath of a bit of trouble in Aldershot at a hotel there. People were jailed, and they were almost judged to be guilty before they even had a trial. They were called far right. There was a huge sense that the law was being weaponised against them and was being used to protect people like Rudakabana, Valdo Calicane and the likes. And today, the pendulum swung, and it did its job. And I think that's vital for any healthy, functioning democracy and judicial system.
Yes, and the politicians meddled. I mean, the Home Office, so the Home Secretary must have authorised this. So the Home Office put out a statement that basically implied they were all guilty, that they then had to take down, because that's just outrageous. Keir Starmer tried to take great credit for getting everyone will be convicted as soon as possible. He must answer for his part in this. He is causative of everything that has happened. We have ended up in a good place because Mr. Justice Goose is a very gifted judge, and because of the decency of the people of Southport. The problem in the summer last year was our politicians, who are so weak and so controlling that they meddled, they they made the public feel uncomfortable. The public have a sense. The public could tell something was, not on, not, and it's just, we need to stop being like this. We can't, our focus in life should not be to manage the narrative. It should be to have a good, well-functioning country. We're not, because somebody from one racial group goes and does something bad, that doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly turn into Nazi Germany and put them in concentration camps. I mean, that's just not who we are. We actually, it's funny because they say now multiculturalism has failed. But I actually think we're a quite good example that it hasn't, and we are actually pretty multicultural. The idea that we're going to be racist is nonsense. So why are our police force? Why is their primary worry stopping racism when I don't believe any of us are racist? I think it's gone. Anything that was there,
thank you.
over.
Stephen Barrett, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. We're still waiting for that Crown Prosecution Service press conference. But before that, I'd like to cross to another guest now, absolutely fascinating guest, and that is a former Prevent employee, Charlotte Littlewood. Charlotte, welcome to the show. Welcome back. You sat in the studio the other nights when I presented Farage, and I really, really wanted to get you back on today because you're somebody who's worked for Prevent, the counter-terror organisation, which has come under a huge amount of criticism during this case because Axel Rudakabana, of course, slipped through the cracks 3 times, was flagged to Prevent 3 times. Now we're approaching a stage where the entire Southport situation, the grotesque debauchery, the triple murder, will be investigated systemically, institutionally. The police, social services, Prevent, politics, the judiciary, everything will be looked at. Where did we go wrong? And how can we make sure this never, ever happens again? But I think people at the stage, Charlotte Littlewood, we can't be having it. Oh, we must learn some lessons. We must move on. People want action. But before we get to what happens next, could I ask you to repeat some stuff you said on the show the other night? Where on earth do you think Prevent went wrong in the case of Axel Rudakabana? How can it be that someone with such an obvious pattern of offending, of psychopathy, can simply vanish through the nets and then go on to kill 3 children in cold blood?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said yesterday, I think that there's been a localized failure here, but I think just to bring back to what's happened today, to understand that localized failure a bit better, we've heard that he had this obsession with violence, and we've heard from Justice Goose, in contradiction actually to the guests you've just had on, but Justice Goose said that there weren't any clear terrorist cause here, and the cause is still unclear. However, the culpability is as if he committed a terrorist offence, which is why we've seen the sentencing that we have, which I'm so relieved about. That was a huge worry of mine all day. But it's this obsession with violence without a clear ideological cause that has ended up with Axel falling through the services gaps. Now, I said yesterday, this would not have happened in the boroughs I worked for, and the Prevent teams I worked within. We would have found a way to tick the ideological box come what may, so he would have moved on to the Channel panel. And I think when he threatened to stab classmates for racism, at that point we'd have ticked the far left ideology, and then he would have been seen and discussed at the Channel panel, at which point he'd come across the other services, the child services, who'd had him call himself into child services. And then that conversation would have happened between child services and the Prevent team. We both have this case in front of us. What do we do? And at that stage, I think he'd have had fast-track mental health support, ideological support, the police potentially involved. I know they've been involved in other stages as well. And we may well have not seen the horror that we saw in Southport. It's really heartbreaking, and it's quite worrying to point the finger at a local team. And I feel somewhat a guilt in doing that, because I know that there's someone who is sitting there who knows they potentially didn't fill in that form properly, and that must be incredibly hard. But I do think that's what it's going to come down to, that this understanding of violence without an ideological cause, an obsession with violence, cherry picking different ideologies, trying to stick an ideology to a violent intent, just doesn't have a service and doesn't have a clear box. And someone didn't find the right box to put him in, and he wasn't escalated.
Isn't that part of the problem, though? We saw with the independent review of Prevent's strategy, in fact, it was William Shawcross who wrote that report, and he said something very, very interesting. It's this: the Prevent seem obsessed with the far right, as in fact the Prime Minister was. As in fact the mainstream media were. In the aftermath of this, they were just all obsessing about the far right. And there are numerous reports coming out, Charlotte, that Prevent has been captured by a woke ideology that's determined to see the far right as an emerging force when the evidence is to the absolute contrary. We know, and you've told me before, that the payload, the workload with Prevent is what, 75, 80% Islamist terror, the actual terror threat. But I wonder if in the case of Axel Rudakabana, that we have here a man of Rwandan descent planning to attack white people. Well, that didn't seem to bother them. It didn't seem to tick any box. And I put it to you, that means the entire system is flawed. If you've got a guy studying genocide, if you've got a guy who seems to have a problem with white people and he happens to be black, it's utterly grotesque to think that can be waved away because it didn't fit one of their check boxes.
So I can speak for one of the boroughs I worked in which he absolutely would have passed through the checkbox system and moved to Channel. And I really struggle to believe that the case came in and the first responder didn't deal with it because he was not white and he was attacking white girls and he was black. I really struggle to believe that to be the case. And yes, there is a overzealous approach to the far right. It's what I found when I was in Prevent is practitioners felt it was far more comfortable to talk about the far right, politically comfortable. You almost have you're afforded a halo if you're tackling far right racism. When you're tackling Islamism, people are shy. People are worried about being branded racist. And the way in which discussions around Islamophobia have gone and the attempt for an Islamophobia definition has come to the point where tackling Islamist extremism can sometimes be understood as Islamophobic. There's, problems within the definition itself. And so understandably, there's been a shying away from it. And that's naturally led to a greater attendance to far-right cases. But that doesn't mean the Islamist cases are not coming through and being handled. So I think it's...
Sean, if I may interject, isn't this the problem we've seen, though, with the rape gangs? We've seen this with the grooming gangs, call them what you like. When it's white people being singled out, being raped, or in this case, murdered, it didn't seem to prick the fancy of people who worked at Prevent. It didn't seem to be an issue. It didn't tick a box. And isn't that the problem? The entire institution is not fit for purpose. If the mindset is, it's too uncomfortable to look for Islamist terror, it's too uncomfortable to look at British Pakistani Muslims raping and torturing young white working class girls because we might be considered racist or Islamophobic, then the entire institution is unfit for purpose. And if we're to have any hope of having any faith in things like Prevent, we need an absolute inquiry that not only clears out this ridiculous, poisonous, enabling mindset, root and branch, but people need to be held to account. Who were these people who passed Rudakabana by? Why didn't they pass this up? And I put it to you, they should face also the full force of the law.
So I just want to take you back a few stages there. I think we've internalized blasphemy essentially in this country, and we have got to the point where we are fearful to deal with issues that emanate from Islamist extremism because we have been intimidated by backlash from Islamists to anything that is insulting Islam. And that affects people on a personal level, and that's almost been taken in on a personal level, and people monitor themselves. And that's something I think that has really affected Prevent from a practitioner perspective. What you're talking about when it comes to grooming gangs and what you're talking about on a local authority level is quite often political. And you're talking about appeasing groups for votes and not getting involved in pointing the finger about the fact that this was all Pakistani men, and they were targeting white women, probably because of the way they think about white women, and that could well be linked to
that's the truth.
Cultural upbringing.
That's what happened. That's the truth.
But that comes down also to politics and votes and political appeasement. So it's about prevent training. I think still the tools of prevent, the system of prevent is brilliant. It's about how it's implemented. You have individuals worried about implementing it, but then on a local authority level, you have the councillors and the local authorities worried about votes, and that's a whole different discussion.
I hear you, Charlotte. I hear you, and I agree. But I put it to you: if you say prevent is a brilliant toolkit, but we don't have people, who work for it that are prepared to implement those tools because they're afraid, we've got a serious problem. So that either means we need different people to be wielding the tools, or we need much more power for them to be able to implement it. Because if not, I put it to you, prevent is being entirely and utterly discredited.
We need to understand the difference between anti-Muslim hate and anti-Muslim bigotry and what has become known as and understood as Islamophobia. We have got to a point where we are monitoring ourselves and not tackling real issues because we're afraid of being Islamophobic. And the definition itself, what's been proposed within the APPG, is stifling speech around issues that need to be tackled. I think we need to differentiate between anti-Muslim hate, Islamophobia. We need to ensure anti-Muslim hate, which is a real issue, and Muslims are suffering from anti-Muslim hate in this country, is understood and tackled, and we step away from what has transformed into sort of a blasphemy regulation, and we have practitioners who are worried to deal with the issue. I don't know if that's the case with Axel. I don't know if that is the case. We can't know yet what happened on that local level. It could be, but I think it would be more because he didn't have an ideology that was clear. I think that's what it will be.
But if that's the case, then, I mean, Sakir Starmer has already intimated this is a new kind of terrorism. I don't think it is. We've had people like this. We've had psychopaths since the beginning of time who've gone on killing rampages. But the point is, if we have prevent, which is meant to be an interface to mop these people up, and he's been flagged to them 3 times, then, clearly it's not working. And if it's not working, we've got to change the way that we screen people, change the way we refer to people. And actually, is the bigger problem an issue of personnel, an issue of mindset? Are they? And as you said, there's more of a halo. It's a ridiculous situation. There's a halo to find the far right. When was the last time anyone on the far right went on a killing rampage and killed 3 girls? It's ridiculous. The mindset, is it not part of the problem? And actually, have they, and I hate to use this phrase, have they got blood on their hands for not flagging this psychopath earlier?
So I just want to say, Keir Starmer's wrong. This wasn't a terrorist offence, and this is not a developing terrorist threat. But this is something Prevent is equipped to handle and has in the past handled, which is unclear, colliding ideologies. And so we've got an issue here where, yes, it's not terrorism, therefore does it really fit within Prevent? Perhaps not, but Prevent has been dealing with it for a number of years. Prevent is best equipped to deal with it. So whilst we have nothing else to deal with it, how about Prevent continues to deal with it as it has been in the past? It was more than 50% of the caseload at one point. So we've got a lot of people obsessed with violence or unclear of their ideologies who have nowhere to go, no system to support pulling them away from this. So Prevent handles this for now until we find something alternative.
OK, well, thank you for being on the show. And it is absolutely fascinating. Thank you, former Prevent employee Charlotte Littlewood. Thank you for helping us try and make sense of what feels like an astonishingly nonsensical situation. Now, let's cross live now back to Liverpool Crown Court and join my colleagues, Mark White, and I believe he's also with Sophie Reaper. Welcome to the both of you. We are waiting patiently for that Crown Prosecution Service press conference. Any idea when that may start? And is there anything new coming out? Tell us more.
Well, in terms of the Crown Prosecution Service, Martin, we are expecting a statement from them. Of course, these things are always fluid after the end of a case, as the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, government circles get their ducks in a row and decide when they can get cameras to certain locations. So at some point, that's all I can say to you, in the next hour or so, we'll get these statements. But I can't be any firmer than that, because no one has shown at this stage, and everybody's still, of course, absorbing the news, that very significant sentence handed down to Axel Rudakabana of 51 years, the minimum term that he must spend in prison. He will be 69 years of age before he's ever eligible for parole. But Mr. Justice Goose here pointing out, Martin, that Axel Rudakabana will very likely die in prison.
Yeah, no doubt that will be the case, and some might say that'll be a fitting finale to a wasted life. Sophie Reaper, it's always the hardest part for anybody to listen to the personal vignettes that come out in so many of these cases. You know me. I've been moved to tears. Mark White was earlier today. We're only human. When you find out how these terrible crimes have impacted people. We saw it with the Brianna Jai case. We saw it with Valdo Calacane. You're in that court today. You heard what the impact statements were saying. Can you share with viewers joining us at this time of day some of the most emotive and poignant moments that leapt out to you?
Of course, Martin, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. In this job, we do hear some truly horrific things. But I think today, for me, and I would imagine for Mark as well, that it is up there for some of the worst things we've ever heard, certainly in a courtroom. Those victim impact statements, the mood in the courtroom when they started to be read out was almost indescribable. The amount of heartbreak, the amount of emotion, it is just unbelievable. The actions of one individual, how they have changed the lives of so many innocent people. These were children that we're talking about, and I want to just revisit, as you said, some of those statements. One in particular, read out by one of the girls in the attack. She addressed Axel Rudakabana, even though he didn't have the courage to be in the room. She addressed him and she said, "I want you to know that you changed mine and my sister's lives forever, but whilst you live behind bars alone, I will make sure that my sister and I and our family will do our best to move forward with our lives." We also heard a statement from the mother of Elsie Stankham, one of the girls who did lose their lives in that attack, so young and so tragic. And Elsie also, Elsie's mother, I should say, also chose to address Rudakabana. She said, "That day we lost our beloved daughter, Rosie lost her big sister, and all three of us lost our best friend." She said, "We will not let you know anything about her, Elsie. You don't deserve to know what the extraordinary person she was. What you did was not only cruel and pure evil, it was the act of a coward." And the word coward we also heard in court today, shouted out by the father of another of the little girls who lost her life, the father of Alice De Silva Aguirre, when Axel Rudakabana was removed from the dock after he continued disrupting proceedings, after he continued to shout at the judge that he was ill and he needed a paramedic, that his chest hurt, and ultimately he would not let those proceedings continue, and Justice Goose was forced to have him removed. As he was taken from the dock, Alice's father shouted, "Coward," and that is a word that I think will resonate throughout these proceedings, that there's been so much courage shown by the families of the victims, by those who were involved in the attack. Hearing from Leanne Lucas, of course, the woman who organised that event, hearing their bravery and their strength in contrast to Axel Rudakabana, who essentially did anything he could today to prevent him from being in that dock, and hearing the truly horrific impact he has had on the lives of those people.
And Mark White, so the political reaction now is beginning to the sentence. Just want to read out a couple of comments to you and see what your reaction to that is. The Southport's Member of Parliament, the local MP to the area where the tragedy of killings occurred, Patrick Hurley. He said that the sentence was unduly lenient. He's asking for the Attorney General to review the sentence, but then it's worth pointing out, Mark White, that when looking back over similar cases, it's one of the highest terms given out in history. Mr. Justice Goose, of course, detained the 18-year-old for life with a minimum term of 52 years. And when you look at other cases of a similar nature, in fact, the Manchester Arena bomber Hasham Abedi, 23, he was handed a record-breaking 55-year term. And so as a consequence, actually, it seems that a lot of people are saying the sentence handed down was firm. On the balance of your great experience of these kind of cases, Mark, do you think the justice was served today?
Well, listen, for many people, and I'm sure for the families, no sentence handed down short of a whole life sentence would be appropriate and enough for those people, and understandably so. But this is a stiff sentence, there is no doubt about that. 51 years before he's even eligible for parole, and indeed Mr. Justice Goose saying that he firmly believed that this young man will be an old man and eventually die behind bars, because because you are eligible for parole in 51 years' time does not mean that you are necessarily going to get parole. In all likelihood, perhaps you won't get parole. The difficulty, I think, for the judge in this case is, by his own admission in his sentencing remarks, he said that had Axel Rudakabana been 9 days older, had he been 18 at the time he committed those murders and other stabbings, then he would have handed down this whole life tariff. But because he was 17, the law is that he cannot receive a whole life tariff. So this was, as far as the judge is concerned, a significant sentence that he could hand down. But yes, you're right, no level. Okay, we're hearing people shouting in the background about the sentence that's being handed down. But 51 years is a minimum sentence, is a significant sentence, but bearing in mind for many people, and understandably, that no sentence short of a whole life tariff will be enough.
Thank you there, Mark White and Sophie Reaper at Liverpool Crown Court. We're going to cross back now to the studio because Chris Hope has joined me, and the political reaction is beginning. Chris Hope, you have some breaking news lines for us. Who's been first to respond?
That's right. Just getting started now with a political reaction to this shocking news for Liverpool and the sentencing of Axel Rudakabana. So Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, says this: the thoughts of the entire nation are with the families and everyone affected by the unimaginable horrors that unfolded in Southport. No words will ever be able to capture the depth of their pain. I want to say directly, he says, to the survivors, families and community of Southport, you are not alone, he says. We stand with you in your grief. What happened in Southport was an atrocity, and as the judge has stated, this vile offender will likely never be released. And finally, after one of those harrowing moments in our country's history, he says, we owe it to these innocent young girls and all those affected to deliver the change that they deserve. Now, we know there's a public inquiry into the Southport killings. That will develop in time. We know there's a review of Prevent, of course, that you were talking with your Prevent person earlier. The fallout of what happened in Southport starts today. Kemi Badenoch, of course, the Conservative leader, has issued a longer statement. I'll read out parts of that now. She says that Rudakabana should never be released from prison. His age means he hasn't got a whole life sentence. There's a strong case, she says, for amending the law to be clear that judicial discretion to award whole life sentences applies to under 18s. Remember, yes, the killer was 9 days short of his 18th birthday at the time of the murders, and that's why the judge could not give a whole life tariff. She says the Tories will start to explore that immediately. That's the politics of the sentencing, Martin. She also says her heart goes out to the victims and their families. None of us can imagine your pain, addressing them directly, and we owe you justice. She says the public inquiry is a step in the right direction, but it falls short of what's required. And bear with me, Martin, there are two things required according to the Tory leader. Why wasn't Ruda Cabana apprehended sooner? The question you're asking repeatedly. Key question. Second point, the transparency of information during and after the unrest that followed this barbaric incident. That's the point about the demonstrations and riots. Why wasn't the government clearer about what happened here, the terror link we described so repeatedly? One of her greatest frustrations, she says, is the deflection which follows domestic terrorism incidents. It's absurd, Kevin Badenoch says, that we are debating online knife sales, that's the Amazon issue with Home Secretary talked about on Tuesday, more than integration. So why talk about how you buy a knife when they're in kitchen drawers across the country and not integration and how we safeguard our society from extreme ideologies and violence? It goes on, if I may.
Sure.
Keir Starmer's statement on Monday was disappointing. Do you remember how it wasn't raised in PMQs?
Yes.
When no one knew why. She now says that the statement on Monday was disappointing from the Prime Minister. He sidestepped...
So why didn't she raise this at PMQs, as we said on Wednesday?
Well, let's not relitigate that. She's saying it all now, so let's give her the credit of doing it now. He sidestepped the core issues, she says, focusing instead on legal definitions of terrorism. By avoiding hard truths, he inadvertently politicised our response to this tragedy. The Tories, she says, will not avoid hard truths. We are under new leadership. We will support the government to do the right thing. However, we won't hesitate to challenge the PM on the task he has to ensure that those who welcomed into Britain, that they share our values, contribute positively to our society, and how we make sure this continues through multiple generations. So you're hearing now from the Kevin Badenoch saying things she didn't say in the Commons yesterday.
Yes.
Saying here that the reaction from the PM has not gone far enough. Why wasn't this killer caught sooner? Well, the public inquiry might go towards that. And why wasn't the transparency of information during and after the unrest that followed this barbaric incident clearer?
Now, the problem with this is that in opposition, it's easy. Valdo Cavalcante was a huge case.
Nottingham killer,
the Nottingham triple killer, and the Conservatives were in power. And there's a huge public debate about the leniency he was served. He didn't go to a full prison. He went to a mental institution. He was treated in hospital. He could get out, and he gets benefits when he's in jail because he's a mental health patient, not a prisoner. He's still being paid by the state. That happened on the Conservative watch. So I find it a bit distasteful, actually, to start playing some sort of political blame game. However, I do think you're absolutely right. The political post-mortem of where everything went so terribly wrong and how people who complained about it were called far right and how people who protested against it, not all of whom were rioters, were deemed criminals before a trial by the CPS, including a 13-year-old girl who's contacted me at GBNews. Now, there are a huge amount of questions to ask, but let's start with prevent. Let's start with the immediate inquiry into what happened with Axel Ruda-Cabana. You heard my interview with a former Prevent employee there. She said they polished their halos chasing the far right. It's seen as a virtuous pursuit, whereas it's far less savoury or desirable to chase the actual threats. 75% of the casebook, Islamic terror. Now, we don't know if this is Islamic terror. We've been told it isn't. We've been told it isn't terrorism. Multiple interfaces, different stimulus, genocide. He was saying he was going to go and attack white people who've been calling him racist. That didn't prick up the conscience of Prevent. It didn't tick a box. You can't be racist if you're a black man going to go and threaten to stab white people. The entire system, Chris, I put it to you, is totally unfit for purpose. Is it a political mindset? Have they been captured by a woke ideology which won't let them see the real problem? And if so, Chris Hope, we've got a serious issue.
That will be and should be addressed in the Prevent review.
Will those questions be asked?
Well, one would hope so. Why on earth the Prevent, the three times it was referred to Prevent in 2019 and 2021, why was that not triggering alarms? The 10, I think, found with a knife on 10 occasions, expelled from school, 10 occasions. I mean, the police, the local social services, local health chiefs...
What do you have to do to get nicked? 10 times the knife?
It felt... I mean, I'm from the area. I'm from Formby. I know Range High very well, and Formby. This is not an area which one would assume this kind of behaviour is linked to that. It may be that the... I don't know this, that Prevent wasn't aware of the risk. It can happen anywhere, these killings, as we know, and I think certainly in an area which I've never, ever heard of anything like this happen where I grew up. Looking again at what I think Kemi Badenoch is offering ideas here, the Tories are now looking to reiterate on how to give whole life terms to under 18s. He was 9 days short of his 18th birthday. Also, they are concerned here about why wasn't he picked up sooner. Again, the public inquiry will look at that. And the issue of transparency of information. Come clean with everything you know as soon as you can and not allow this lack of information to fuel the trouble.
Chris, I'm just going to put this point back to you and, dare I say it, back to Kemi Badenoch. Let's look at the timeline. He was missed by Prevent when the Conservative Party were in government. It's not good enough to blame Sir Keir Starmer for this. It's not good enough to come out with a political blame game. This happened on the Conservative Party's watch. So how can you come out and start having a pop at Sir Keir Starmer? I'm trying to be politically neutral about this. The entire establishment, whatever party, has failed here, and it does no favours, in my opinion, to start making this a political blame game so soon afterwards. We need a root and branch clear out of these institutions. We need a full, transparent public inquiry. By the way, we need one of those for rape gangs. We haven't got one of those for that. This one we have. Let's hope some good comes out of this. And top of the list has to be the mindset of Prevent.
On rape gangs, of course, the government is assessing the scale of the problem after the GBNews has uncovered issues in 50 towns, not the 4 or 5 that were examined in the Electus J inquiry back in 2022. Going back to what Keir Starmer says, he is making clear that they will deliver the change that these girls deserve. I mean, it's not just girls, of course. There's 8 or 10 or so of others who were seriously injured by the knife attacker. So I think Sir Keir Starmer's he's holding back. He won't want to influence this inquiry as it takes shape. Kemi Badenoch is offering ideas, solutions, but as you say, a lot of this happened. The issues happened. They were not picked up on the Tory watch, and that's a problem for the Tory party as much as Labour.
And also, these girls were failed. You know, the statements of like saying we cannot allow these girls to be failed, they were utterly failed by the entire machine. The first job of any society has to be to protect its children. There's been an abject, utter, systemic failure at practically every level.
And that's admitted by Keir Starmer. They admit the state failed. There's no hiding from that. Why that happened, whether it was through political correctness, as you're suggesting.
We heard this before. Lessons will be learned. No, mistakes will not be repeated. They have been. Again.
What we don't know, and no one is here from the government to defend it, but what they would say, I imagine, is that there are all sorts of dreadful people who are apprehended before they do these awful things, and occasionally they don't get them all. I mean, that's all you can say about it. And knives are freely available. He bought one on Amazon, but they are in kitchen drawers. I mean, they are around everywhere. And why and how he was radicalised, I think, is what the government will be looking at also, with the online safety measures coming in shortly.
And I do think, actually, that point about somehow blaming Amazon is patently and provably ridiculous. I mean, do they think we're silly to assume that Ruddock Obama wouldn't have killed unless Amazon had delivered him a knife? You can get a knife in any kitchen drawer. You can steal a knife from any hardware store on any high street. It's not knives that kill people, it's psychopaths. And psychopaths are becoming radicalised in ways that our radicalisation services aren't picking up. Stop deflecting. Stop blaming an online retailer.
I think that point from Kemi Badenoch does land. Again, she says here, it's absurd that we are debating online knife sales more than we are integration and how we safeguard our society from extreme ideologies and violence. And that's the point. These are points I would say she could have made at the dispatch box for more power.
We were all waiting for that moment at PMQs yesterday. Nevertheless, it's come. And actually, that is a very, very fertile area to explore. Integration. If we have Axel Rudakabana, we were told, don't forget, was born in Wales, a choir boy, a cherubic picture of him as a Doctor Who extra.
We weren't told that. I mean, that was the reporting. But no, to be fair, that was what the journalists found out. You looking at Facebook. We weren't told that by anybody. It's merely what we uncovered.
We were told by the media.
What we weren't told by the government is the degree of risk and the escalating.
That's the point.
The escalating threat of this individual. All we had was what we had publicly, but what the authorities knew, we weren't told. And that's the point about transparency that Kevin Badenoch is making.
And there could be and should be a full post-mortem of what could have been done differently in those early days. Now, this is what Nigel Farage is under attack for saying. You've got Angela Rayner saying it's fake news. You're a conspiracy theorist. All Nigel Farage said was, I think the authorities know more. Well, that's true. It was proven yesterday.
Well, on the issue of Farage, I mean, we should mention this. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, did say it was fake news to link it to terrorism shortly after the dreadful tragedy unfolded in Southport. She said then, let's get to the facts, let's look at what the actual solutions are and what we can do about the horrific situation that we find ourselves in, not to stir up these fake news online. That's because Farage had said we're not being told the whole truth the day after the stabbings.
Which was true.
On
and
Twitter.
Has been proven
he said
to be
on
true.
Twitter. Farage now says many public figures, including Angela Rayner, made derogatory, he says, and insightful remarks, he says, about my comments in the vacuum, he calls it a vacuum, that followed the terrorist attack in Southport. It's an appalling cover-up, he says again, and I deserve apologies. There's a lot of things to happen in politics before we can stop talking about this issue.
I think you're absolutely right. And let's have a brief bit of good news now, because you were here. It was an astonishing moment. Well, let's face it, it's been a very, very difficult and dark day, let alone for the survivors and for the families. Of course, we should remember them and honour them first. But we had a wonderful moment, did we not, Chris Hope, where the starter of a fundraiser came on the show. You can see it on your screens now. And the individual who started that was a gentleman called Mark Foreman. Mark Foreman, he helps the Hesketh Round Table in the area, and he very movingly came on the show earlier, and he told us about how he heard the police helicopters from his kitchen, and he rushed down there, and he learned of this scene of abject devastation. He knew people in this community. He's a pillar of the community, and you can see on your screen, helping the Southport families after the 29th of July 2024 attack. A fundraiser started on GoFundMe, and we featured it on the show around about the end of the 3 o'clock hour, about an hour and a half ago, in fact, a couple of hours ago, and at which point it started on £69,000. And we put the call out to GB News viewers to start to donate, and Chris has called up the live sum now. The latest tally is over £147,000. So the latest sum is £147,468. That means that during the process of this show, we've comfortably more than doubled that fund, and it's going up literally in real time. I want to pay credit and read out a few names now. David Butler has donated £100. David Cragg, 25 quid. An anonymous donor, a very generous anonymous donor, £500. Kira Garforth, £50. James Phillips, £100. Derek Noble, £20. Christine Price, £30. Suzanne French, 10 quid. Every penny counts. Lisa Richmond, £5. Daryl Goodman, £10. Ray Bryant, £100. This is literally going up like a fruit machine. It's an astonishing, beautiful thing to see. And Chris, on a day like this, to see the generosity, the milk of human kindness, and Mark Foreman told us that every penny raised for this fundraiser will go directly to the families impacted and the children who survived themselves and their families, to help them, in his words, create new memories, to help them believe, to help them ride back the crest of the wave towards positivity. Chris Hope, I thought that was an amazing moment, and I'm simply blown away by the generosity of GB News viewers and the broader British public.
We always are at GB News amazed by our viewers and their generosity, and to see that happen, 147,643, it's doubled in an hour and a half, Martin, since that interview with you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much to everybody out there. I know that Mark Foreman was moved to tears by your generosity, and so was I. But look, we've got some breaking news for you now. We were waiting patiently for that CPS statement, and they've just released this statement, which I shall read out to you now in full. And here it is. Axel Rudiker is a murderer. Utter devastation followed as he acted out a meticulously planned rampage of murder and violence. His purpose was to kill, and he targeted the youngest, most vulnerable, no doubt in order to spread the greatest level of fear and outrage, which he did. 3 days ago, he pleaded guilty to all 16 counts against him, saving the families of the victims the trauma of reliving the events of that day in a trial. But he has never expressed any remorse, only cowardice in his refusal to face the families whose lives he has forever changed. This has been an extremely difficult case for the whole prosecution team and police officers at Merseyside Police. They've had to work through some harrowing footage and evidence. And this sentencing brings to an end this case. But the events of that day will leave a tragic legacy that will unfortunately endure for many years. And that's Sarah Hammond there, speaking from the Crown Prosecution Service. Chris Hope, what's your reaction to that statement? I mean, they're absolutely right. An utter coward. Now will rot in jail for 52 years, and some will say that's sort of day too short.
Well, the CPS have got a successful conviction of this individual. Nothing went wrong with the case, and that is to their credit. They have got questions to answer. If the police are correct in saying they couldn't release more information around the time, shortly after the days, the weeks after what happened, despite the concern on the streets, there are question marks about the CPS process at that point. But you have to say to them, thank goodness these families have got a degree of closure, and they will have closure. I've been in the room. I think I heard from Sophie Reaper's reporting that the Southport killer was not in the dock to hear him being sentenced. And again, there's a long-standing issue with other criminals not being there to hear the sentencing. But I think they will have closure tonight. And the CPS deserve credit for getting that closure for the families. But there are wider questions for the organisation there about why they apparently, according to the police, our reporting says, they weren't able to say more about what the truth of what happened shortly after it happened. OK, just got a short while to go. Stick with us, Chris, if you could. If any more political reaction comes in, please feed it back to us. But I'd like to move on to my next guest now. Fascinating guest, and somebody I've got a huge amount of admiration for, and that's the clinical and forensic psychologist, Dr. Naomi Murphy. Naomi, it's wonderful to see you under such trying circumstances. It's been too long since we worked together last. And, of course, I met you in your capacity as a senior prison psychologist at HMP Whitemore there in Cambridgeshire, where you worked with Category A prisoners, some of the most disturbed individuals in the entire British prison system. Psychopaths, killers, serial killers. It's your job to try and understand their mindset. Having seen the evidence and having observed this trial and having heard the ruling today, what do you make of this case and of the mindset of Axel Rudiker?
It's obviously absolutely awful and stands out as being particularly disturbing, with this being a particularly disturbed young man. You know, children who become fascinated by violence are typically children who felt very vulnerable and feared for their own life. But the number of incidents that have occurred where he's come to the attention of people, the fact that the school were frightened to go to the family home without the police being there, lots and lots of evidence that this man has been disturbed for quite a while.
When I've spoken with you before, and I came in to meet you at HMP Whitemore, I was blown away by your programme there to try and understand and help rehabilitate some of the most violent offenders in the entire British prison system. You have a special expertise of these types of individuals. And one thing I remember you saying to me is that typically, we don't know in this instance, but typically chaos is bred from chaos. If you were looking into this case now, would you be looking way back into Rudiker early life, perhaps trauma he may have been through?
Absolutely. I think the fact that he has, operated through the prism of hatred suggests that he's felt and experienced hate. But, children who are raised within homes where they feel safe and loved and have felt protected don't grow up to be the kind of young person who commits this kind of act. So I would definitely be wanting to know, what kind of things have happened to this guy earlier in his life, particularly around the age of 13, when he's reported to have had quite a dramatic change. That does correspond with puberty, but you wouldn't expect this kind of fascination with violence to occur without some degree of disturbance and trauma in this person's life.
And so many people are just trying to make sense of this madness. That's the only word that I can use. It might be a blunt word. It might not be the most appropriate word. People are just trying to find out some framework. How can it be that somebody brought up in the United Kingdom, a diverse, a tolerant, a welcoming society, the father of a Rwandan, how can it be that they become a creature such as this? In your experience, what's going on?
Well, as I've said, I think trauma is a massive part of this person's picture. I don't think that this young man would have behaved in this way without having a history of trauma. I think, we're very good at pointing the finger at various organisations, but I think we have to think as a society, what are we doing whereby we're missing children? Children are going under the radar. So we're not noticing when they're troubled as they are. We're not intervening early enough. We've decimated services for young people and families. So what support is there available to support people if they are showing signs of trauma? It's heartbreaking to see this happen.
And Dr. Murphy, what do you say to people who say Rudy Kobana's just evil? He doesn't deserve to be treated. He doesn't deserve our sympathy. He doesn't deserve our taxpayers' money. People like him, we'd be better off without them. You've no doubt heard that many, many times in your career. What do you say to that?
I totally understand that attitude. I think when we see the monstrous acts, it's impossible to see anybody but a monster. But I know from speaking to many people whose crimes have also been heinous, different kinds of crimes at times, but equally as distasteful and abhorrent, that actually when you start looking at what some of the earlier factors are, you can see that people make sense. We don't see that because we don't know all the ins and outs of this man's life, but actually if we were to have those insights, and many of the people I worked with in prison were not considered to be mentally disordered at the time that they were sentenced, but actually as we've become more familiar with their histories, we've been able to build relationships and get honest answers from them, then we start hearing some of the details of the trauma.
And Dr. Murphy, as Rudy Kobana, now he's a Category A prisoner. He's got a heck of a stretch ahead of him, 52 years minus that small tariff, 51 years, 190 days. He won't get out until Sunday, the August the 2nd, 2076. Now, that is a long stretch. You've worked extensively in Category A jails, places full of other psychopaths, other killers, people that might want to make a name for themselves, people who might want to cause great harm to Axel Rudy Kobana. Could you give us an insight into if you're in prison for a life term yourself and you're not going to get out, might some prisoners think it's a worthwhile use of their time to do some damage to Axel Rudy Kobana? And how does that work in prisons?
Well, that's a really good question, Martin. I totally understand people wanting people to spend their whole lives in prison. But actually, if you take away the hope of getting out, what you do is pass that management problem onto the prison staff. So it's the prison staff who will be left managing volatile individuals who've got nothing in it to behave themselves, because why would they? It's not going to make a difference, really, in terms of the course of their lives.
Do you think people and I know you have huge experience with this. I'm asking you because a lot of people don't think that people like Rudy Kobana should even get therapy or treatment or sympathy. He should rot in hell. What do you say to people like that? Is there a hope of ever rehabilitating people like Axel Rudy Kobana?
That absolutely is. You know, when I first started working in Whitemoor, I met people I felt quite hopeless about what's the chance of them changing. But actually, if you offer somebody the possibility of change and you believe that it's possible for them to change, people did. So people who'd been written off, you know, the men who came to the project I worked in were considered to be untreatable psychopaths. They were not able to access any of the treatment in prison because of this lack of hope for their ability to change. And yet people did go on to make change, did go on to be able to progress and to be able to move down through the prison system.
OK, it's always fascinating to talk to you. It's been way too long, and please let's talk again at some point in the future. And that's the clinical and forensic psychologist, Dr. Naomi Murphy. And just want to tell you guys now a quick story about when I met Dr. Naomi Murphy in HMP Whitemoor. I went in there to do a mental health speech to serial killers, you know, some of the most disturbed people in the entire British prison system. And I spoke to prison wards who, they were ex-forces, commandos, some of the toughest guys you'll ever meet. And they said when they first got into the prison system, they despised the inmates that were killers and paedophiles. And they thought actually the best thing to do was to cause them harm. And the more they worked with them, the more they realised that was futile, because these people had only ever understood violence. And today, as we try and make common sense of this unworldly, despicable, grotesque act of mass murder upon children, it's a very, very confusing and dark world. And, you know, a lot of people have been getting in touch with this show, I know, don't think Axel Rutherford deserves any sympathy or treatment. But look, it's been a hugely emotional day. Now, Chris Hope, before we go, has there been any quick political feedback? We've got a quick moment before the end.
I'm digging out now, Martin, for you. Two MPs for Reform, Rupert Lowe and Lee Anderson, are telling the Express there is now a time to debate the death penalty. That often happens in these situations with extreme emotion after such a dreadful details emerged today. Rupert Lowe has told the Express this: "It's my opinion that now is the time for national debate on the use of the death penalty in exceptional circumstances." He says this is an exceptional circumstance. Reform UK Chief Whip Lee Anderson adds, "I've been consistent on the issue of the death penalty. The yes animal has no right to breathe the same air as the rest of us." Again, emotions running high. OK, that debate will roll and roll, no doubt, on Jubes & Co. That's up next with Miriam Cates. I'll be back at 7 p.m. on Farage, and again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Thanks for joining us today on a hugely emotional day. Thank you. Next time, view weather.
Despite the morning rain, it'll be a nice, warm, cosy day ahead. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Storm Eowyn is fast approaching. The Met Office have issued red weather warnings. We don't issue these lightly, and they're in place for Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland for damaging gusts of wind tomorrow. Here comes that storm, as I said, fast approaching. Ahead of it, we've seen this weather front provide some very heavy rain and gusty winds. That's now heading out into the North Sea, staying fairly soggy, though, well into the evening across parts of Scotland. Then drier for a time, but here comes Storm Eowyn, a spell of heavy rain accompanied by gusty winds, snow for a time across Northern Ireland, quite a bit of snow falling over the hills of Scotland during Friday. Temperatures actually probably rising through the night, but the winds will also be intensifying and getting particularly strong on Friday morning. We have a number of weather warnings in place. Those red warnings for Northern Ireland, Central and Southwest Scotland. Gusts of 80, 90, perhaps even more than that in terms of miles an hour. In exposed areas, we could be close to 100 miles an hour. Particularly bad across Northern Ireland in the morning, that morning rush hour, and then the strongest winds transferring to southwest Scotland during the late morning and into the early part of the afternoon. But it's very windy everywhere. Damaging gusts also possible. We have the amber warning over parts of northern England and North Wales, and yellow warnings covering things further south, where it'll be a wet start for East Anglia and the southeast, but a much, much milder start than we've been used to. That rain will tend to pull away through the day. The winds will ease a little over England and Wales, and actually for many here it's a dry and a fine and a sunny day, but those dangerous gusts still continuing, easing maybe in Northern Ireland by lunchtime, but then into the southwestern corner of Scotland, and the very strong winds then transferring to northern Scotland later in the day. With some brightness, we could reach double figures for a time across the south, but obviously feeling cooler with those winds, which continue to cause problems across the northern parts of Scotland. Please stay up to date with the forecast. You can see all of those warnings for yourself on the Met Office website. Bye for now.
There will be